Apologize for the delay, but welcome to the Santa Barbara Planning Commission hearing for the 30th of this month. If you'll join me in the flag salute. Ready? Begin. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Ms. Graham, if you'll do the TV coverage announcement and the roll call, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the Commission. Planning Commission hearings are televised live on County Santa Barbara Television, CSB TV Channel 20 at 9 a.m. in the South Coast, Lompoc, San Ynez Valley, Santa Maria, and Orchid areas. Rebroadcasting of Planning Commission hearings are on Fridays at 5 p.m. on CSB TV Channel 20. This hearing will also be streamed live on CSB TV's website. And now for the roll call. Commissioner Cooney?
Here.
Commissioner Brown? Here. Commissioner Park?
Here.
Commissioner Farini?
Here.
And Chair Blau?
Here. Thank you. And now we'll go to Mr. Wilson for the agenda report and the protection report.
Good morning, Chair Blau, members of the Commission. The current status of the agenda for today is that there are 2 items on the standard agenda. Staff is here and ready to present both of those items to the Commission today for your review and action. Moving to the projection report, our next meeting is June 6th, and that will be in Santa Barbara. There are 2 items projected on that. I think both of those items are actually returning for your further review and consideration. Following that meeting on June 6th, our next meeting the next scheduled meeting is June 27th. However, there are no items on that day at this point, so we can trail that to the end of today if we need to move anything to that date, or we can cancel it upon your review. Then after that is the July 11th. That will be in Santa Maria here. There are 2 items on that date that are projected for that date. And then we have a meeting in July 25th in Santa Barbara. And there are currently only 1 item on the July 25th, but that could change. And then moving forward, we have August 1st in Santa Barbara, and there are 3 items on that date. One thing I do want to talk about is a date that we would want to have that process improvement workshop. We were looking at June 27th, but there are no items on that date. So we're looking at potentially a date in July. Maybe the July 11th date would work, or maybe the July 25th.
Commissioner Cooney.
Mr. Chair, this gives me an opportunity to advise that I will be out of the country on the 25th of July. I see the only item. There wasn't an item last we met, but now there has been a first district item set for that date. But I will not be here, so I'm hopeful that we wouldn't have the process improvement workshop in addition on the 25th. But I will be here on the 11th and could do it then.
Yeah, I'm hoping we can do it the 11th as well. I'd rather do it sooner than later. And I'm going to suggest that unless there is some urgency to the housing use determination, that we move that to August 1st. It's simply 7 days later, and if you're not going to be here, I don't like the idea of doing first district items when you're not available. So if we could do that to accommodate Commissioner Cooney, I'd appreciate it. Mr. Wilson?
Chair Blau, we can make that change. Move the QAD housing to August 1st, and we'll let the applicants know.
Okay. And the only other thing I would comment on is if we are going to do this workshop on July the 11th, that we make a concerted effort to make sure that we get all of those consultants that normally are hired by developers and landowners be aware of that meeting, asking them to bring their concerns and their problems to that meeting.
And Mr. Chair, if I may, I think it's important if there are members of the community, other than people in the development community who've gone through the process one way or another. I think that there needs to be some information out to them that we are also looking for their input on certain processes, because I hear that from constituents. Oh, it was this or that. And so I think we need to hear that as well.
Well, speaking from recent experience, it's so damn complex that if you're not,
you've got to be.
If you're not a consultant that's been doing this for 20 years, you haven't got a prayer to get through it.
You don't know, right? I agree.
I agree. Don't have a prayer.
Having done it myself, I totally agree.
Yeah. So, all right. Any other comments or concerns about the projection report? Seeing none, I'll go to the go for public comment. This is a time that we reserve for public comment on items not on today's agenda. Commissioner Park, I see we have no slips in the box. Seeing no one rise, I'll assume all those are for items that are on the agenda. Not finding any, we'll go to Planning Commissioner's information reports. No lights. I'm sorry. Excuse me, Commissioner Brown.
Yes, thank you. Mr. Chair, just one, I wonder if we could get a briefing for at our next hearing on the status of the cannabis ordinance to understand where we are in the process and what's happening and when it's going to become effective. People have been asking me, and I understand the land use piece, but I don't understand all the other things that the board have been doing and when all that might be implemented. And one of the reasons I asked is we got a letter from Ms. O'Neill concerning her issues, and I'm just looking when the county's going to start enforcing their ordinance.
Well, I think, isn't it, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but there's today will tell us a whole lot because we're voting today. So
I understand that piece, but I didn't know.
If we get the revenue, then they'll be able to do.
I get that, but I didn't know, was it, beyond that, I don't know anything, so just helpful if we could get just some information on what the implementation likes, and maybe Mr. Kleeman can tell us now, I don't know.
Commissioner Cooney.
I didn't Ms. Black give us a brief oversight of where we were and how much we had facing us before enforcement could start. I don't think there's a problem in asking her if she gives a report today.
No, I don't have any problems with that if she has that information. Right?
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, no more lights. We'll now go to, we have the minutes of May 2nd, and I think that's the one Commissioner Cooney wants to modify, or is it the other one?
No, it's May 2nd.
May 2nd, okay. Commissioner Cooney, go ahead.
I just had a couple of concerns when I read through the minutes relating to the Abid track map, which begins on the bottom of page 2. And it has to do with a concern that I think maybe needs a little more time to address. Perhaps we want to continue this and revise these minutes, or at least take the time to do the revision during the day and approve them later. If I could just draw your attention to page 3 at the bottom, the last paragraph. This has to do with the future availability of the Gaviota Water District having its moratorium terminate and requiring the applicant to sign up for Gaviota Water prior to building permits. At the bottom of page 3, twice we refer to the applicant property owner, and then there's really, I think, an argument that could be made by a subsequent property owner that we were just referring to Mr. Abbott in particular, and it might be years and years before these building permits are applied for. And I just don't want there to be any ambiguity at that time that whoever owns the property is required by this condition to follow its provisions. And then while I'm at it, a similar concern on the next page, on page 4, We also require the applicant to record a buyer beware disclosure, and we don't refer to property owner at all there. So, you know, whereas we did in the prior paragraph put a slash and then property owner, I think at the very minimum we want to be consistent. So those are my comments.
And I'll just follow it and to say, I think we need to get the word applicant out of there entirely and just refer to the property owner. So it's clear that whoever owns the property has an obligation. And the way the condition was intended to read was that at the time anybody the owner pulls a building permit, if public water is available, they need to make a connection. If it's not, then they're able to use the shared well system. It's just not real clear in the minute, so I think we should just bring those back to us at our next hearing, and we'll approve them later on. So, do we need to make a motion for a continuance of the minutes, or just wait to have you come back? Yeah, I don't think we need to vote on that. So let's just go to the minutes of May 9th. And do we have any corrections or changes on that one?
I'll move approval, Mr. Chair, of the minutes of May 9.
Second.
We have motion to first and second. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Approved. Okay, great. And now we'll go to the director's report. Do we have Ms. Black in Santa Barbara, or?
Chair Blau, members of the commission, would like to excuse Director Black as she's out of town.
Oh, okay.
Actually, she's, out of the state. So I'll give a brief director's report. There was a comment earlier about having Ms. Black talk about the current status of the cannabis ordinance. Daniel Clemens, the Deputy Director of Long Range Planning, is here, who, under the director's report, if you wanted a brief summary of where we're at on that, he's well versed in the cannabis ordinance and the status thereof. But looking at the last Board of Supervisors hearing that occurred since we met last was on May 15th. The item that was brought there was the ordinance amendment that had to do with the like-for-like changes or rebuilding. It was applicable to the Coastal Zone, Montecito Land Use and Development Code, and the LUDC. The Board of Supervisors at that hearing approved the ordinance amendments, and they accepted or approved staff's recommendations without any changes at that hearing. So that was the result of that hearing. In addition, there was an item on there in regards to the Gaviota Coast plan and having the board look at the modifications that were submitted by the Coastal Commission. So that at that hearing, the board had a choice whether to accept the modifications by the Coastal Commission or not. They decided at that meeting that they weren't ready to take action on the modifications presented by the Coastal Commission. Instead, they have continued that item, and then they're going to hold a public workshop on July 3rd that's going to be led by Supervisor Hartman and Supervisor Williams to gain additional public comments in regards to the Coastal Commission staff. They've asked if the Coastal Commission staff could be present at that workshop, but they're looking at for further public comment on the recommended mods on the Gaviota Coast plan. And then they plan on returning back to the board on July 7th in order to decide whether or not to submit a comment letter from the board for the Coastal Commission hearing in August. So those are the two items of note on the May 15th Board of Supervisor hearing on that date. Did you want Deputy Director Clemens to talk a little bit about cannabis, or do you want to wait till?
We'll hear from Commissioner Brown first. She's got a question, and then I'll go to Mr. Clemens.
The mods on the Gaviota Coast plan pertain to topic. I'm sorry, I don't
Commissioner Brown, I will let Deputy Director Daniel Clemens talk a little bit about the mods that were presented, if that's okay.
Okay, and also if you could speak to the short-term rental issue that went before the Coastal Commission, their last meeting. Okay, thank you.
Mr. Clemens, you're on deck.
All right, Chair Blau, Commissioner Brown. Just to clarify, for the Gaviota Coast plan, I believe Mr. Wilson said July 7th would be the date where we'd be returning to the board. It's actually July 17th. Just want to correct that so there's no confusion. So, with regard to the Gaviota Coast Plan modifications, there were actually quite a few modifications that the Coastal Commission staff requested to be made to the plan in order for them to make a recommendation of approval to the Coastal Commission. And those modifications consisted of everything from changing our policies with regard to environmentally sensitive habitat, that is, not only how we define environmentally sensitive habitat, but then also the types of habitats would be afforded the protections of environmentally sensitive habitat policies in the coastal zone. There are also a number of other changes with regard to everything from our public and recreational policies, our trail policies, and just a number of changes that were requested. And I should back up and say that we conducted a series of meetings with Coastal Commission staff to negotiate these modifications, and there were actually many more that they're originally requesting, and we were able to talk them down from some of those and revise the ones that ultimately ended up in their recommendation to the degree possible. So what we did is we felt that some of those would be controversial amongst constituents and decision makers, so we requested that the Coastal Commission not take action on the Gaviota Coast Plan. And this is a technicality administrative procedure, but because the timeline for them to take action on the plan was it was approaching, what we actually had to do is we had to withdraw our submittal package and resubmit it. It's really not going to change. It's not like they start the clock and they go through a full review again. That was just specifically for the purpose of giving us the additional couple months to go back, talk to the board, and enable the board to get additional public comment and then be able to submit a letter, and we would go to the Coastal Commission hearing and represent the board's position as stated in that letter. So as Mr. Wilson stated, on July 3rd, Supervisor Hartman and Supervisor Williams are going to be conducting a workshop. It's going to be a great start to the 4th of July holiday, at which they're going to solicit more input. And then on July 17th, we're going to go back to the board, and the board will make a decision as to what they want to do based upon the input received on July 3rd and any additional testimony that's presented on July 17th. And what we'll be doing is presenting those comments to the Coastal Commission in August when they take action on it. So, any questions on that?
Don't have any questions. Let's go to the cannabis ordinance.
You got it. So for cannabis, it's important to consider the inland areas differently than the coastal areas because they have different decision paths, so to speak, and when they will become operative. So for the inland portion, right now, what we're doing is a number of things. So first off, the inland regulations become operative when the treasurer tax collector files a letter to the board stating that they have found a financial institution that will accept the monies. And we actually, in a more practical requirement, although it's not written into the ordinance, is that we have to have a way to transfer that money, collect it, take it back, and do that securely. So the Sheriff's Department, Treasurer, Tax Collector, the Auditor, Controller, the CEO are all working on the financial aspects of cannabis permitting. It is looking very likely that come mid-June, that financial institution will be established. The letter will be filed with the Board of Supervisors, and the inland ordinance will become operative. Also, what's going on right now is there have been coordination meetings between the District Attorney's Office, the Sheriff's Department, County Council, the CEO, and our department on enforcement. And we're looking at, for example, for those who cannot be permitted, even under the new regulatory regime that's coming into effect, how we're going to go about enforcing against those folks. And then for those who would likely be able to be permitted under the new regulations, there's kind of a different approach with them, because what we want to do is we want to transition them into the new regulations. So we're talking about strategies, how we're reaching out to them to try to give them as much information as possible so that they can start getting ready for permitting. So that includes everything from, for example, we're preparing a number of permit application materials, information brochures, and that is not only for the permitting side of things, but also for licensing, because recall the CEO and the Treasurer Tax Collector are taking the lead on cannabis licensing. So they're also concurrently working on setting up all of their procedures for licensing, which includes all the financial considerations that I mentioned earlier. So that's the inland area. So once again, we're looking about mid-June. We're going to go live in the inland areas. Exact date to be determined, but it is most likely to be mid-June For the coastal zone, as Mr. Wilson stated in his director's report, we just submitted the coastal regulations to the Coastal Commission staff to start the certification process. So there it's a different game because we have a longer time. We have to wait until the Coastal Commission certifies the regulations, if they decide to do so, before they will be able to be implemented in the coastal zone. So the board has directed us to basically develop a procedure which involves a planner consultation or something to that effect, whereby we would be going to the cultivators in the coastal zone, particularly in the Carpinteria Valley, to give them kind of like a planner consult and say, okay, if the Coastal Commission is to certify these regulations in their current state as the board has adopted them, this is what you'd likely be required to do. From our read of what we can see on your site, it looks like you would have to tweak this, do this, you're doing things correctly here in order to get them in line such that if or when those regulations become operative, they'll be set up so that they can go ahead and submit their applications and process them as quickly as possible. So, any other questions?
Thank you. Short-term rentals is the last item you need to address.
I'm sorry, excuse me.
Short-term rentals?
Short-term rentals, yes. So the Coastal Commission considered the short-term rentals Local Coastal Program amendments. And at the hearing this month, there was quite a bit of public comment presented about the fact that short-term rentals were not allowed broadly enough throughout the coastal zone. So you may recall that there was a zoning overlay created specifically for the Miramar Beach neighborhood area in which short-term rentals would be allowed. And then throughout the remainder of the coastal zone, homestays, which is a short-term rental whereby the property owner resides on site while the short-term rental is being used, were allowed anywhere a residence is allowed. So there was substantial commentary about the lack of allowance of short-term rentals throughout other areas in the coastal zone. More people want to see it. So for example, along Padara Lane, there are a number of property owners who submitted commentary, public comments, written, oral, where they said, hey, we've also been using our property as vacation rentals for quite some time too. We believe we should be afforded the same sort of opportunity as what is being afforded to the Miramar neighborhood area. So after receiving public testimony, Coastal Commission decided not to certify the regulations. And there was not a really good, crisp reason for that. They just generally stated in terms of coastal access and affordable accommodations for visitors to the coast, there is an argument to be made that it should be allowed throughout other areas of the coastal zone. So right now, the effect of this is that there are no regulations with regard to short-term rentals. Anywhere a dwelling's allowed in the coastal zone, you may use it as a short-term rental. And what we will be doing this month is we're going to be returning to the board to get direction from the board as to what the board would like us to do given the Coastal Commission's decision on this. Do they want us to do nothing? Do they want us to go back and consider amendments that would apply throughout the entire coastal zone, that is allow short-term rentals throughout the entire coastal zone? Or would they like a more modest expansion of that overlay that doesn't encompass the entire overlay zone? Based upon that direction, we'll take a look at our work program and we may have more work to do. So,
any further questions? I'm not seeing any. We will now go to our standard agenda. Ms. Graham, if you read the first item into the record, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The following is the hearing at the request of the Board of Supervisors to review the proposed new projects in their 5 years CIP for fiscal years 2018 through 2023, pursuant to Government Code 65401 and 65402.
Thank you. Mr. Lackey, are you going to present, or Mr. Moore, are you going to present to us?
Good morning, Commissioners. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, perfect.
All right. So hi, my name is Stephen Counts, and I'm a planner with the Long Range Planning Division of the Planning and Development Department. And today I'll be presenting the 2018-2023 Capital Improvements Program, also called the CIP, for Comprehensive Plan Conformity Review. Okay. So the purpose for this hearing is for your commission to review the new capital projects that are included in the 5-year CIP as referred by the Board of Supervisors. And it's to consider the conformity of these projects with the comprehensive plan pursuant to Government Code Section 65401 and Section 65402. So in the following 4 slides, I'll give a quick overview of the CIP process and the government code requirements. So to start, I'll go over a little background on the process. So the CIP is a compilation of county proposed capital projects that implement various plans, including the county comprehensive plan. The CIP is prepared and administered by the county executive office. And while the CIP does cover a 5-year period, it's updated yearly to reflect ongoing changes, including new projects that are added and completed projects that are excluded. So this slide shows how today's hearing fits within the annual CIP process as a whole. So the process begins each year with each department submitting proposed new projects to the CEO in the winter. And then the CIP is developed by the Budget and Research Division of the CEO's office in the spring. In May, the Board of Supervisors conceptually approves the CIP and then forwards the new projects to your commission for conformity determination. And today, your commission will review the new projects within the CIP for conformity with the comprehensive plan, and then staff will recommend that you forward your findings to the Board of Supervisors to receive and file at a hearing in June. So Government Code Section 65401 requires 4 things. That the county prepare a list of new projects recommended for planning, initiation, or construction. That the county perform an annual programmatic level review of new capital projects. That the county determines conformity of the new projects with the county comprehensive plan. And for the Planning Commission to report the conformity determination to the Board of Supervisors. Section 65402 requires that the county perform a project-level review of new capital projects that require any of the following. 1 being acquisition or disposal of real property, the vacation or abandonment of streets, or the construction of public structures. As with Section 65401, 65402 requires conformity determination of the new projects with the comprehensive plan. And it also requires the Planning Commission to report the conformity determination to the Board of Supervisors. So in the current 2018-2023 CIP, there are 6 new projects that are proposed. Staff has reviewed each new project for to determine conformity with the comprehensive plan. All 6 new projects were reviewed with conformity pursuant to Government Code Section 65401, and none were actually reviewed in conformity with Section 65402 because none involved the construction or acquisition of a public building or structure. This is just a quick breakdown of which departments the projects came from. So since there were 6 projects in total, 1 came from the probation department, another from the social services department, and 4 were from public works. Attachment B of the staff report lists all of the new projects and their associated conformity analyses for the purposes of Government Code Section 65401 and 65402. The new projects include equipment purchases, infrastructure improvements, and facility maintenance programs. Staff recommends that 3 of the 6 projects are found in conformity with the comprehensive plan pursuant to Government Code Section 65401, and 3 projects will require future conformity review, which I will address later on in this presentation. So, just to reiterate, there were no projects set forth for review that would involve the acquisition or disposal of property or land. Therefore, Government Code Section 65402 determination was not required or necessitated. Attachment C of the staff report includes 3 new projects for which the conformity determination should not be made at this time. Location, project description information, and coastal development permit requirements, as well as mitigation plans, have not yet been finalized for these projects. Therefore, further analysis is still required. The CIP serves as a funding mechanism that helps prioritize funding for projects. It does not appropriate funds or otherwise commit the county to particular projects. The CIP is therefore not considered a project as defined by CEQA, and therefore is not subject to environmental review. The notice of exemption is enclosed as attachment D to the staff report. So to wrap up the presentation, staff recommends that the Planning Commission take the recommended actions as listed on page 1 of the staff report, including to consider new CIP project conformity with Government Code Sections 65401 and 65402, report County Planning Commission's conformity finding to the Board of Supervisors, and determine the Planning Commission's review of the CIP is not a project pursuant to CEQA. And that concludes my presentation. Staff is available to answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you. Does the commission have any questions of staff? I'm not seeing any lights. I'm going to go ahead and now ask for any public comment. I have no speaker slips for this item. Seeing no one rise, I will close the public hearing for this item. Bring it. No, she's not rising, so I assume no. I would have a slip if she did, I would think. So we need to get a motion to move this forward. Commissioner Brown.
Thank you. I'll move staff's recommendation.
Second.
We have a second. Thank you very much. Ms. Graham, roll call, please.
Commissioner Brown? Aye. Commissioner Freeney?
Aye.
Commissioner Cooney?
Aye.
Commissioner Park?
Aye.
And Chair Blau?
Aye.
Motion passes 5-0.
Great, thank you. We're going to go ahead and take a 5-minute break now while we set up for item 2. Thank you. Okay, we're ready to go back on the record. Ms. Graham, if you read item 2 into the record, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The following is the hearing on request of the Planning and Development Department for the County Planning Commission to consider making recommendations to the Board of Supervisors regarding the following: 17 ORD 5 to address permitting requirements for hoop structures and shade structures, and the Program Environmental Impact Report 17 EIR 4 pursuant to the state guidelines for implementation of the California Environmental Quality Act.
Thank you. Ms. Harris, are you going to give us the staff report this morning?
Good morning, Mr. Chair. Apologize, these mics work a little different than in the South County. Good morning, everyone. I am the project manager for this project and will be presenting it this morning. So to begin, hoop structures and shade structures are removable plant protection structures that are used in agriculture to enhance the growing environment, protect the crops, and extend the growing season. Due to the cost of the structures, they are used primarily to grow high-value crops such as raspberries, blackberries, and blueberries, and more recently they're beginning to be used as well for strawberries. The structures allow farmers greater flexibility with crop selection and rotation, as they can be erected where needed to enhance production and protect crops more sensitive to the elements, moved to other parts of the farm when crops are rotated, and removed entirely when no longer needed. Since 2016, the building code exempts from building permits readily removable hoop structures that are 20 feet or less in height without permanent structural elements. The building code also exempts shade structures. The County Land Use and Development Code, or LUDC, defines hoop structures and shade structures as structures that cannot have permanent structural elements, such as permanent footings or foundations, and cannot have electrical, lighting, plumbing, or mechanical elements. Furthermore, the LUDC does not identify these structures as allowable uses in the Agriculture 1 and Agriculture 2 zones. A strict reading of the LUDC would therefore indicate that they can't be used. However, considering this internal inconsistency in the LUDC and absent greater clarity, the Planning and Development Department would not prohibit their use, but would require these structures to be permitted as greenhouses, which are the most similar types of structures. That is, they would be permitted with a land use permit if less than 20,000 square feet in area, or a development plan if 20,000 square feet or more. To address the inconsistencies and uncertainties of the current regulations, in July 2017, the Board of Supervisors directed long-range planning staff to move forward with the project and environmental review. The board directed staff to develop amendments that would clarify permit requirements and the permit process, expressly allow hoop structures and shade structures in the agricultural zones, provide a permit exemption for hoop structures that are 20 feet or less in height, and identify development standards that must be met to qualify for the exemption. The Board of Supervisors' direction formed the basis for the project description that was analyzed in the environmental document. A Program Environmental Impact Report, or EIR, was prepared to analyze the potential impacts that could result from the placement and use of hoop structures and shade structures, often referred to as crop protection structures in the EIR, throughout the county's agricultural zoned lands. The EIR did not analyze the impacts of cultivation, as this is currently allowed and exempt from permits. Key mitigation measures were identified that would reduce impacts to a level that would be appropriate to allow the use of crop protection structures with a permit exemption. Planning and Development hired Recon Environmental to prepare the EIR for this project. The EIR analyzes the potential impacts resulting from the proposed projects in the 6 issue areas listed on this slide. Of the 6 issue areas analyzed, 4 potentially significant impacts that could not be fully mitigated, or Class 1 impacts, were identified. 3 of these impacts to aesthetics and visual resources, and 1 impact to resource recovery and solid waste management. 5 impacts that could be mitigated to less than significant levels were identified for flooding and biological resources. 7 mitigation measures were identified in the EIR. All of the measures have been incorporated into a revised ordinance amendment, which is included in Attachment C, Exhibit 1 of the staff report. The mitigation measures can be grouped into 2 types. First are measures that would reduce impacts to a level appropriate to allow the crop protection structures with a permit exemption, that is, without a permit. Second are measures that would be required for all crop protection structures in order to reduce the impacts of these structures to the maximum extent feasible. These measures would be required whether or not a structure is exempt or requires a permit. I'll now review the 7 mitigation measures, beginning with the 4 measures that would be required to allow a crop protection structure to qualify for the exemption. First, mitigation measure Viz 1 amends the ordinance so that, in addition to the standard structural setback in each agricultural zone, to qualify for the exemption, structures cannot exceed a height of 12 feet within 75 feet of the edge of right-of-way of a public road or state scenic highway. This mitigation would reduce visual impacts, but not to a less than significant level. Second, mitigation WR1 amends the ordinance so that only structures located outside a floodway would qualify for the exemption. Within a floodway, structures must be assessed case by case through a permit process and may be allowed provided a civil engineer makes a no-rise determination indicating that the structures would not result in the rise of floodwaters during a storm event. This requirement is consistent with the County Floodplain Management Ordinance, which takes its direction from FEMA as far as how structures are regulated within a floodway. This mitigation would reduce flooding impacts to less than significant. Mitigation Bio 1 amends the ordinance such that the permit exemption is only allowed for structures located on historically intensively cultivated agricultural lands. The measure defines what is meant by historically intensively cultivated agricultural lands for the purpose of allowing the permit exemption. Mitigation Bio 2 amends the ordinance so that to qualify for the permit exemption, any crop protection structure located within 1.24 miles of a known or potential California tiger salamander breeding pond shall ensure that a minimum 1-foot gap is maintained between the bottom edge of the plastic material and the ground surface to allow free movement of the salamander. This measure would also reduce potential biological impacts to less than significant. Next, we'll review the 3 measures that would apply to all crop protection structures, whether exempt or subject to a permit. First, Mitigation Viz 2 amends the ordinance such that a setback of 400 feet from the urban boundary line of the county's unincorporated urban townships would be required if the crop protection structure could be viewed from public roadways or other areas of public use. If the structures could not be viewed from these public areas, the size setback would not be required. This mitigation would reduce visual impacts, but again, not to a less than significant level. Mitigation Viz 3 amends the ordinance such that the crop protection structures would be limited to 4,000 square feet in area when located within the design control or D overlay of the San Ynez Valley Community Plan area. If the structures could not be viewed from the public roadways or other areas of public use, this size limit would not be required. This mitigation measure would also reduce visual impacts, but not to a less than significant level. Finally, Mitigation Bio 3 amends the ordinance to require a minimum setback from streams and creeks to ensure consistency with several policies and development standards of the comprehensive plan. This measure would reduce impacts to biological resources to a less than significant level. The CEQA guidelines requires that an EIR compare the effects of a range of reasonable alternatives to the effects of a project. The alternatives selected for comparison should be those that would attain most of the project objectives and avoid or substantially lessen one or more significant impacts of the project. The CEQA also requires an evaluation of the no project alternative. This EIR evaluates two alternatives in addition to the no project alternative. Alternatives 1 and 2 both build upon the proposed project and the mitigation measures of the EIR. We'll present each of these in more detail as components of these alternatives may be of interest to the Commission. The no project alternative is the status quo. No LUDC amendment would be approved, resulting in no permit exemption for any crop protection structures. Planning and development would continue permitting these structures as greenhouses, and the no project alternative would not meet the project's objectives and would not be of any benefit to agriculture. Alternative 1 furthers the protection of biological and visual resources by requiring additional standards to qualify for the exemption, including a minimum 100-foot setback from most biological resources, not just streams and creeks, and a height limit of 12 feet within 200 feet of public roads and state scenic highways and within the critical viewshed corridor overlay. I mentioned a moment ago that the EIR mitigation would limit the exemption to crop protection structures located on historically intensively cultivated agricultural lands. A second component of Alternative 1 would allow crop protection structures on the uncultivated lands to be permitted with a zoning clearance instead of a development plan, with additional steps to ensure compliance with any state or federal regulations protecting environmentally listed species. This alternative meets project objectives and is identified as the environmentally superior alternative in the EIR. It incrementally decreases impacts, but it doesn't avoid or substantially decrease the impacts, nor does it decrease any of the impacts to less than significant levels. Alternative 2 seeks to reduce significant impacts to visual character and scenic views. To qualify for the permit exemption under this alternative, there would be a height limit required of crop protection structures to 12 feet on all lands that are zoned agricultural 1 and on entire lots adjacent to the state scenic highways. This alternative meets project objectives. However, most impacts would be similar to the project's impacts, and it would not avoid, substantially decrease impacts, or decrease impacts to less than significant levels. The draft EIR was circulated for a 45-day public review period, during which time Planning and Development held 2 environmental hearings. Staff received 12 written comments on the draft EIR and 4 oral testimonies at the environmental hearings. Responses to the comments were prepared and added to the final EIR as Section 9. Also, minor text revisions were made to clarify the final EIR, but they did not result in a change to impact classifications or to the addition or modification of any mitigation measures. The final revised ordinance amendment can be found in Attachment C, Exhibit 1 of the staff report. It incorporates all of the mitigation measures identified in the EIR, including the additional standards to qualify for an exemption and the standards that would apply to all structures to further reduce impacts to the maximum extent feasible. This is the staff recommended ordinance amendment for the Planning Commission's consideration. And therefore, staff recommends that the Commission make the findings for approval and recommend that the Board of Supervisors make the findings for approval, including the CEQA findings and the Statement of Overriding Consideration. Staff also recommends that the Board of Supervisors, that the Planning Commission recommend the Board of Supervisors certify the final EIR and adopt a resolution recommending that the Board of Supervisors approve the Hoop Structures Ordinance Amendment. This completes staff's presentation, and we're available for your questions. In addition to the county planning team, we also have our consultant, Jennifer Campos from Recon Environmental, here today. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Our questions of staff. Commissioner Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I know we have a lot of public here, so I'm going to limit my questions just to a couple and then wait until after we hear public comment. I have two questions. One has to do with the visual resources. How is the determination ever to be made that hoop houses of whatever height would not be an impact to visual resources if they're located in the distance? And the reason I ask that question, it seems to me that as someone who likes our ag lands as they are, with the wonderful vineyards and orchards and row crops, is that anything in the distance covered by a sea of plastic is going to be affecting visual resources. So how do you make that determination viewed from a public roadway that some distance is going to ameliorate that impact? And how would you make that determination anyway?
Commissioner Brown, through the chair, I don't believe that we made a determination in the EIR that there would be no impacts or less than significant impacts at a greater distance. I think what we state is that at a greater distance, there is less of an impact. It doesn't mean that it's not a significant impact. A lot of the issue with visual resources really depends on where and how much and how many hoop structures end up being constructed. So we have lots of agricultural land in the county, and we're proposing an exemption, and it could occur anywhere on these agricultural lands. And so there is a potential that you could have greater impacts or lesser impacts depending on how much is constructed and used and where it's located.
Okay, and then my other question has to do about hoops in floodways. Are there currently hoop houses in floodways?
Commissioner Brown, through the chair, there are some hoop structures based on our 2015 aerial photo that we used as the basis for our analysis. There are some hoop structures located within some floodways. I think it was primarily within the Lompoc Valley that we observed some.
Okay. And do they go through this process that's envisioned now in terms of having some civil engineer?
Commissioner Brown, through the chair, currently they should be going through the process, but it's our understanding that most have not been approaching the county and requesting permits.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Commissioner Cooney.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning, Ms. Harris, and thank you for an excellent summary of a complicated matter, and certainly something that we've been wanting for a long time. I have a question like Commissioner Brown as to the restrictions on visibility. It's like an escape is suggested if, regardless of what the other regulations would require, if you can't see the hoop houses because they're not visible, then you don't have to comply with one or another of the regulations. And so I have two questions related to that. First, what if hoop houses are constructed behind a row of trees and other vegetation, and they're partially visible? Is that then subject to the regulation, that structure, or not? And the second question related to that is, what if the hoop houses are constructed, the trees block it to a substantial degree, not entirely, and then subsequently the vegetation is removed, the tree row is cut down, or the vegetation is taken out? Does that then require the hoop house owner to come in and get a permit without regard to the exemption for invisibility?
Commissioner Cooney, through the chair, the mitigation measure as it's currently drafted would not allow reliance upon vegetation or a windrow of trees to be considered a reason for saying that the structures are not visible. So you would have to place yourself on a public road or public viewing place, and if you could see the structures with or without the trees, I mean, if the trees are there, you could assume, oh, maybe I'm not seeing them now, but the trees or landscaping is not considered a reason to not then have to comply with the additional setback. So you would need to it would need to be not visible from a public road because of other structures that have been permanently built, buildings, or because of the topography where you couldn't actually see the structures because there's some intervening topography, but not the vegetation, because vegetation can be transient.
And by vegetation, are you including trees?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
I just have one question. What was the thinking behind the idea that you would exempt lands that have been highly developed for agriculture as opposed to a parcel that has never been farmed before? I mean, one of the things I'm guessing, and I'll find out from some of our farmers in the audience, but is it likely that I could take a somewhat marginal piece of land that hasn't been cultivated, use hoop housing, and be more successful and make it viable to use that land? So what was the thinking behind the fact that it had to be used 3 of the 5 years for high-density agricultural? That makes no sense to me.
Commissioner Blau, Mr. Chair, the reason for that mitigation was to not have impacts result to biological resources, in particular the California tiger salamander or other biological resources that could be present on a site that has not been cultivated for intensively for any recent point in time. So currently, new cultivation, any kind of agricultural cultivation, is exempt from permits. So anybody can go out, plow a field that is currently grazed, or convert natural lands to cultivated agriculture, and permits are not required. And in order to address this project and the use of the structures, the only way to ensure that there would be no impact to the biological resources from the the beginning of the use of hoop structures is that they be located on lands that have already been farmed and actively farmed.
Okay, so you're telling me that if I go out there and I take land that's environmentally sensitive habitat today and I just go out and plow it up for 3 years, now I can put hoop houses on there. We'll get to that deliberations. Commissioner Farini.
On the 400-foot urban boundary buffer, that seems like we're going contrary to previous policy where the urban area needs to buffer from agriculture, not agriculture buffers for the urban area. So I couldn't find where that was addressed and why we would make such a policy leap in any of the documentation. Maybe you can point me to that. And then kind of staying with that, it said 400 feet from a line. That seemed a little bit arbitrary and not really beneficial to everybody it may be meant to serve. Wouldn't it be better to pick a distance from, if you were going to do that, from dwellings, not just an urban line? So, and but kind of going back, staying on that track, this 12-foot height requirement that is called out to be used as a visual buffer, I didn't see anything in there where it takes into account the reduction of efficiency or the outright negative effects it would have on the crop production. So it doesn't seem like it's really feasible. It was more just something thrown out there. I don't get where that came from. following on with Chair Blau on no impacts of cultivation were analyzed, and I don't see, since cultivation is part of the operation, I don't see how that's parted out. So maybe if you could give me some input on that, on how you separate cultivation out from cultivated ag use. And then I think, like Cecilia or Commissioner Brown said, we've got a lot of public people that have been waiting patiently. I will have more questions later. Thank you.
I'm sure the public comment will generate lots of questions for us. So I think we'll go for that right now. Ms. Wyman called and asked me to have additional time as the representative from the Growers Shippers Association, which I've agreed to do. So I'll let you come forward first. But I do need to caution you. You delivered us a letter today that's 2 pages long. And the rules are that we would normally have to submit those to be a part of the public record on the Monday before 12 o'clock, I believe. Monday was a holiday, so you had until 2 o'clock on Tuesday. It didn't get to us. So just for your information, unless we voted into the public record, it will not be part of the public record today. And it's unlikely we will do that, and I can explain to you why. But but for your future benefit, when you submit things to the commission for hearing, it needs to be to Mr. Villalobos by 12 o'clock on Monday. And what he does is then he will email it to us. We have a chance to read it and digest it, but we do not have a chance to read it and digest it today. So if you want to go ahead and approach the podium, I've agreed to give you 15 minutes. So please go forward.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the time today and being able to speak. Would it be possible? And I will modify my comments slightly to address the, to fill in some of the details of that letter and speak to that. So, sorry, readjusting strategy slightly, but and I think what I really wanted to focus on today is some of the higher level discussion of details and the, sorry, is the PowerPoint up? Yes. Can you guys see it? Thank you. So the top issues that I want to touch on are kind of the project purpose, kind of a back to basics, discussing some of the feasibility of the proposed mitigation measures, and then touching on some issues of process and precedent. So in terms of purpose, you know, why hoops? We heard rightly that they're a tool for agricultural production. We see it as standard equipment and a routine practice. It's a dynamic practice that is here and then it moves. And so it's something that our members are using in response to fierce competition from in increasing pressures. There's competition from other states, other regions within California, and then in places such as Mexico, Arizona. Our costs of production have increased significantly, and the regulatory pressures that we're seeing from all fronts continue to increase. And so it's very difficult to remain competitive in this environment. What hoops allow us to do is to access these very narrow windows of opportunity to markets that can really sometimes make the difference between being profitable for a season or not. The other thing that it does is it provides an option, freedom of choice for both farmers and farm workers. Some of my members use hoops, some of them don't. Some farm workers enjoy working in the environment. Other people prefer being out in the broccoli field. So it's really having an option available to people for their different preferences and choices. We spoke extensively on the height issue when that was being contemplated by the building code, but the main things that the reason that the height, especially the 20-foot, is important is it allows for farm worker ergonomics and comfort, especially in some of those shoulder rows. At the arc, it can be a little bit crowded, and so it allows a little bit more comfort for the work environment, but it also provides important airflow, and that helps to manage the humidity levels in the fields, which is important for managing diseases in particular, and getting that appropriately managing the condensation and the humidity so that you can have overall more viable and healthy plants, and decreasing the need for certain applications to protect those material or to protect those plants. And the other thing is having enough space for access for machinery and equipment that would need to pass periodically through the field. So I wanted to go, again, I mentioned kind of back to basics. And at the July 25th meeting of the Board of Supervisors, we heard direction to exempt up to 20 feet, for it up to 20 feet be exempt from permits, and that it be simple and straightforward. That was the direction, and went back and listened to the video just to make sure that I hadn't misheard it or misremembered it. But that was pretty clear direction that we heard, and that was our understanding. And what we'd like to express today is that we feel that what's before you today really fails to fulfill that purpose, to try to work with what's already out there to provide a straightforward pathway for permit exemptions. And we'd like to articulate that a little bit more and see if there's a way to kind of go back to basics, discuss why some of these issues aren't feasible, and why, because of that, it fails to fulfill the project purpose. Today I'll be using mitigation measures interchangeably with development standards, just because I think it's easier to reference the mitigation measures. But do you know that I mean both the conditions for a permit exemption and the development standards, that I'm using those interchangeably with mitigation measures. So we have concerns with that for standard agricultural practices, but we also, from the very start, we've been committed to trying to find a path forward. And I have a lot of members who say, we don't like any of it, we hate all of it, we don't think we should be doing any of this, but we're also trying to continue to bring us forward in that path. And so we'll suggest some alternatives that hopefully we'll balance those concerns and address both of those. So, we, again, are trying to show a good faith effort to engage and move this process forward, and understand that there's, that there's a lot of considerations, and that's why we're looking at some other things for your consideration. So in terms of visual, I heard this as feedback from all of my members that the setbacks were going to be a huge issue for them. There was broad consensus about that, and I think it goes to the overarching concerns of, is ag land a visual resource versus a working agricultural land? Is it a place of industry, of being able to cultivate and perform these other things? I think one of the revisions in the final EIR that was concerning was it added this concept of other areas of public use. And so it's not just the roads, but what does that mean, and how expansive is that? And that really leaves it open to additional limitations. So one of the things in terms of having the setback or rather a limitation of 12 feet in the first 75 feet of 12 foot high in the first 75 feet of a field is, being able to have two different sets of production really is infeasible, whether that's two sets of crops or two sets of equipment. You can't have economies of scale as you're trying to manage these crops and be able to have a viable agribusiness. Public roads are ubiquitous in ag areas. They're everywhere, and some of them have signs and some of them don't. So that really would be a significant portion of land that we're talking about. We see the 75 feet with the 12-foot height being somewhat arbitrary, in that we don't perceive that it would provide an additional protection of visual resources, but it would absolutely impact agricultural resources. The impacts are rightly classified as significant and unavoidable, and so if it's significant and unavoidable, we'll show some examples of why we don't think that 75 feet is more protective than what we'll be proposing. Again, that's a Class 1 impact, but it would, again, not necessarily confer the intended benefit, but it would absolutely impact the viability of agricultural lands, and especially some of the parcels. The AAC letter really provided some great examples of parcels that would very much be impacted by these requirements. So here's one example, and this is just kind of Google mapping. These are ball. estimates. I didn't go out with a tape measure on this particular occasion. That might be in all of our future, but it's the slope, it's the orientation, the implication. We have a significant impact on dispersals, but I would argue there's a bit of a rise. This is a foot, and this I would say that they're still visible. And instead of making sense for especially for some of the schools, they're still there. They're still going to be visible. What we code, and basically we've spoken and would affect the majority. 20-foot setback again balances that line that set a 75 setback on some foot border multiple public roads and make the difference between viable inch of the road. And the urban township underline for that again is that I've thought do have of more the same setbacks as some of the other parcels. Sources. This was the limitation on cost and complexity and obstacle. And I really wanted to point out, for the west half of Lompoc, a severe hardship. And at present time, there hasn't been a long history of berry cultivation in Lompoc, but that's because cooling infrastructure accessible, and so that's something that I heard to have the option in the future. If that's something to be able to have option green. Biological resources, and then goes a tiger salamander. This draft recovery plan, nationwide, really is this kind of lighter area here is called the purple dots, or they're calling it the meta populations. You can see that in western Santa Maria, side of Santa Maria, also through or Los Alamos, that encompasses an additional significant acreage, so that those purple out to here somewhere, and so it is under cultivation the stakeholder advisory group that this light green or the darker green is any potential ponds, the blue or the known ponds. And in terms of being able to lower the plastic to the ground, I did get mixed feedback from my members on this, but I heard that for those who need it, it's absolutely essential. And so, and that it's part of why people need hoops and the purpose of hoops. And so having the limitation and not being able to lower that plastic to the ground during certain times of year, for some people, would really limit the effectiveness and usability of hoops. So in terms of our critique on the Bio2, which again is not being, or is maintaining the 1 foot gap on the plastic, we would argue in the AAC letter articulated that there are existing alternatives for migration and dispersal through the access roads of the fields. There's really, again, a lot that we don't know. We have a very limited understanding of the species and its life history. And that for some using the technology, that it's essential to be able to lower that plastic all the way to the ground for certain times of year. And for some people, it's the reason to use hoops. And so if you can't do that in these significant swaths of agricultural acreage, that would be a tremendous hardship and, again, wouldn't fulfill that project purpose of trying to make it workable and feasible. And again, especially the language of it being 1 1/4 mile within any known or potential pond locations, that's really what kind of takes that next step in terms of having such a huge geographic impact for that. So again, we would argue that Bio2 does not meet the project objectives and that it would have significant impacts to ag and the usability of the hoops. There is also discussion about...
Ms. Wyman, I think Mr. Brown has a question for you. Well, okay.
Thank you.
Great.
Thank you. There is also discussion about the historically cultivated lands and the definition of it being 3 out of 5. Some of my members will be speaking to why that's a tremendous hardship, especially for organic production. And the other issue that's come up is kind of the displacement of agricultural lands is some of the cities are building out and completing their plans, and so that's resulted in that. But regardless, everyone has to comply with all applicable local, state, and federal regulations, and there's currently existing protections under both the California and the Federal Endangered Species Act, within those areas. And so we feel that that's adequately protective and that we would not need additional explicit limitations to fulfill that objective. Additionally, the current language in Bio 3, which is a setback of 100 feet from streams and creeks in the rural areas, it's very hard to identify exactly what streams and creeks means, and could potentially have a very significant impact. One of the things is that we would propose is instead to do a 20-foot setback from a 303D assessed water bodies. That's something that I can easily pull up a map and know what that means. And there's qualitative rather than quantitative discussion set forth by the water board, but again, you still have to comply with the water board, with any stream bed alteration issues, and it's not the same as a building. We are not putting a building in these locations, and so that's why we would argue that a 20-foot setback from a 303D assessed water body would be adequate. Finally, I wanted to raise a few points in terms of process and precedent. I won't belabor the point, but it really takes time to build consensus, and these are complex issues, and so just to be able to understand it, and then enough to be able to try to engage with discussion from the different users, and understand what the issues are, and understand well, what is the location of known or potential, or what does this mean? That takes time, and we've tried to move as quickly as we could to bring that. We've tried to engage with both. And the county would have really appreciated their responsive, their openness to listening. We would like to see more responsiveness to that, though. I think we would have liked to have seen some response between the draft and the final EIR. We didn't feel like our comments or AACs were truly considered or truly incorporated in terms of substantive revisions. I think having an intermediate check-in in terms of this is what we're thinking on mitigation measures, and then being able to chug through and say, what does this look like? And what is this going to mean for these parcels? I think really would have helped to make it a more substantive, and having that engagement once the ideas are developed, so that we can kind of ground truth and say, this is what this would mean, and is this going to work or not? Certainly by applying limitations on land use, there's a lot of concern about that. There's elements of the Gaviota Coast Plan that we're seeing in some of the design overlay concepts and the setbacks. Those are really of concern. I think we talk about precedent and don't want to sound like the boy that cries wolf, but I think this is a great example of something that started is having a very focused objective. The elements of that are being moved forward, and we're very concerned about that. And if at the next opportunity, what other limitations are going to be incorporated on other what we consider standard agricultural operations and equipment, rather than structural development. So in closing, our ask would be for the Planning Commission to provide direction to bring forward a zoning ordinance that better fulfills the objective, that's more workable for ag. And we understand that there's competing concerns and priorities, but that better balances that, and again, goes back to the project objective of making this more workable for ag, and recognizing that it's a dynamic, movable piece of equipment. We recognize that there's limitations to recirculation, and we understand that. I think it would be helpful, though, to have an option to bring forward an alternative 3 that, whether that's through alternative 3 in the EIR or direction that accomplishes that goal, but again, something that better matches what we heard as being the project purpose and the intention from the Board of Supervisors, something that my members here will be able to speak to in terms of the usability of the hoops, and that we can move forward with these changes.
Great, thank you. Commissioner Brown, you had a question before.
I have lots of questions for Ms. Weinman.
Okay.
Thank you. And I just want to thank her for that extensive phone conversation I had with you, because it was helpful in thinking about some of these issues. In your presentation, you mostly spoke about Ag 2 in terms of hoops, and not so much Ag 1. And I'm wondering, in your mind and in your people you represent, is there a difference in terms of certainly in the urban area or close to the urban area, there are more Ag 1 parcels than there are in the San Ynez Valley as well, versus the Ag 2 parcels, which are probably in slide 18, way out in the middle of the fields. Is there a difference, or do you feel there's no difference in terms of the visual resource issue? And the reason I ask this is, and it even further changes, that for Ag 2, there should be sort of different permitting levels for the hoop houses. You didn't make any comments on that. Maybe some of your members would, but So that's my question about the Ag 1 versus Ag 2.
Yeah. I think for my comments, it's mostly a matter of familiarity, and the best that I can research, and to the best of my knowledge at this time, and it continues to, grow exponentially every time that we deep dive into some of these issues. We really focused on Ag 2 because that's what we think is most representative of our members in the Lompoc Valley, in the Santa Maria Valley. We do have some limited membership in Cuyama, but really that's in Los Alamos as well. And it appears that that's the zoning. I would say fundamentally there are similar setbacks. My understanding is that the difference is that the Ag 1 setbacks have both front and side that also reference the percent of a parcel. And so it's, we would also support that, but it's harder to put in a 1-second soundbite. So that was the reason. And the other thing too that I just wanted to, in response to that, and I was talking with my trusted colleague about this, and we were looking through some of the pictures, and she said, well, it would make sense that you don't have that in some of the areas because or for example, in the Ag 1 areas that are surrounded by buildings, that is more of a, it would be more compatible with that landscape. Okay. And so I think, or we didn't see that it would be incompatible with that, or, we would see it as being maybe unfair that everyone else can have buildings and that you can't have a tool that would help to promote the viability of that agricultural use. And kind of the last thing that I wanted to leave with is I went to high school in AG, in Rio Grande, and I took a AP Environmental Science class at the end. And at the very beginning of the year, we went out and trespassed onto the field. At the time, it was grazing land behind the high school. And the teacher was saying, oh, look at, all this cattle grazing, and it's so horrible, and it's bad for the environment. Well, by the end of the year, it was houses. And so everything has impacts. And, there's certainly a need for, housing. But I think that really shaped me, and I think it's really balancing those priorities and recognizing that that's a possibility. And kind of the cliche is that that berries are usually the last stop before housing, and there's complex needs of a community, but want to preserve options so that agricultural lands can remain viable.
I want to ask questions about the tiger salamander. So there are now cultivators who are within this 1.24 miles, and they're not observing the regulations that are being proposed. Is that my understanding? Is that what I'm to understand?
So my best understanding is that they aren't regulations yet.
No, but as I said,
what is
being proposed.
Correct.
So they're just doing the opposite of what is being proposed right at the current time.
They're proceeding with standard agricultural cultivation. So for somebody new, what is the process that somebody who isn't using hoops on a ag parcel, for somebody new, do they go, well, I am within this 1.24 miles, I have this obligation under these federal regulations to do something different? What? Yeah. So the 1.24 is new. That's a new concept that was introduced in response to this. So I don't think that.
Well, wait a minute. Is it for just ag, or it's for all development, for other kinds of development as well, right?
I think it's an entirely new.
Okay.
So for example, so I was trying to research a little bit about the 1.24 and where that came from. Well, at the time that it was listed, there was, I think the thought was, and I don't want to misspeak, so please don't quote me on this, but this is my general recollection of the concept, is that they thought that 95% of the species would be, I think it was more like within a quarter mile of a potential pond. So that's something that I think is still maybe not very well understood.
So are the agriculturalists concerned about this issue at all? Because these crops are actively cultivated, so if a tiger salamander gets in there, there's going to be plowed under. I mean, it's the push-pull here. I don't understand how we have actively cultivated fields, yet we're trying to protect. I get why we're trying to protect the species, but we can't do it when we're actively cultivating the fields. It's contrary, is it not?
Yeah. So there's discussion of conservation banks, and so that's something that is
Right.
moving forward in identifying
Right.
both ponds and kind of upland habitat. And that's one thing is I think they kind of like the uplands a little bit, and so I think there's identification of opportunities that are compatible for both. At the time I was reading through the listing and identification of the critical habitat, and at the time it was identified that agriculture was a compatible use, and I've heard several of my members say, well, wouldn't you want them to not be in active agricultural areas? Wouldn't that be more protective to, to have that? And so that's definitely feedback that I heard from my members, feeling that those were not compatible, and that it would actually be more protective of the species to help to exclude them from areas that are of active usage.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And our next speaker will be Ann Citron from in Santa Barbara.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes. Very clear.
Good morning, Chair Blau and Commissioners. I'm Anna Citron with the Law Office of Mark Shatillo, and I'm here today speaking on behalf of the Committee for Land, Air, Water, and Species, as well as the Gaviota Coast Conservancy. I think up front there's a couple of helpful things to consider. First of all, this discussion isn't happening in a vacuum. There are legal requirements, specifically of the California Environmental Quality Act, that significant impacts be mitigated to the maximum extent feasible. So that needs to be kept in mind, and we are of the position that there are additional mitigation measures that could be imposed that would further reduce, in particular, the project's significant visual impacts. The other thing that I think is useful to keep in mind is that we're talking about what uses can be considered exempt. In other words, no permit at all, no county process. And the presentation that I just heard sounded more like what can we do versus what can't we do, not what can we do on an exemption basis versus what we can do with a permit. And I think it might be helpful to hear from staff about the different levels of permitting and what's involved. I was just looking at the permit fee chart, and it looks like for a land use permit, it's $407 for this type of structure. I don't know if that's accurate, but that seems fairly low, whereas a development plan is several thousand. So perhaps what we should be talking about is this structure and whether it makes sense to have a higher bar for something to be considered exempt, and perhaps more types that could be eligible for a land use permit. Specifically what we're looking at in terms of the visual impacts, first of all, the height limit. The EIR discussed that most hoops are 12 feet and didn't clearly explain why a higher height would be necessary, particularly on an exemption basis. And furthermore, in the visual simulations included in the EIR, it wasn't clear that there were any 20-foot structures shown. So I think if you're going to be approving an exemption that would essentially allow 20-foot hoop structures 75 feet from a public road, just under 20,000 square feet to be completely exempt, I think you need to know what that could look like in a worst case type scenario. And it wasn't clear to me that the visual simulations reflected that. So we would request that you give additional consideration to reducing the height limit for the exempt structures and incorporating additional measures such as including the setback, which we do support, and perhaps a larger setback or a height reduction within a larger area would be beneficial as well. So We think that more information would be helpful. We did submit 2 comment letters on the draft DIR that identified a number of mitigation measures that would reduce significant impacts, and we did not feel that the response to comments was satisfactory. In other words, for example, just saying that alternative 1 is infeasible, to me that was not explained thoroughly, and more information would be appreciated. So I don't have a timer here. I don't know where I stand on my 3 minutes.
You're just
but I will
at the end.
I'll conclude. So thank you.
All right, great. Renee O'Neill.
Good morning, Commissioners. I'll be glad when this is all over, and I think you will too. Thanks for doing such a great job on everything. As my letter indicated, we have a grower in our area that is continually out of compliance with the laws. One of his sites was shut down on the spot by the state due to chemicals being found on that one site and a well that he'd put in a creek. To me, it's intuitively obvious that he overlooked something on a site when the inspectors were out there, but this applies, in my opinion, to all his grow sites. We have been observing lately that he removes the covers from his hoop houses and has lights, and because I'm not close to this, but it looks like lights coming up from underneath maybe, who knows, but it's even more invasive than it was when the hoop covers were on. Not that that was pretty either. So I am requesting that you put in the ordinance that the lighting of these grow crops, wherever they are, whether they're under a cover or not, is in the regulations. So with that said, we live in one of the areas in the Tepiscay that is not included in the designated or the D zone in Santa Ynez or listed in any of the urban townships. So these setbacks that you have and these other regulations that are in the language are not, they don't apply to anyone in our area. I can see these hoop houses from the road. I think a lot of you have been up, maybe, if you haven't, you should drive up Tepiscay and go to the top, the 10-point mile marker, and just, it's a field, acres and acres and acres of hoop houses that go back for miles all the way to the forest, and there's no permits for oak removal, for grading access roads, for putting in, what is it now? I think he has 7 wells in the ground now. It's the Wild West out there, and I can't wait for enforcement. And I don't care if the tax doesn't pass. I want enforcement. Thanks.
Thank you. Jason Sherritt.
Good morning, Chair Blau, members of the Commission. My name is Jason Sherritt. I'm here representing the Ag Advisory Committee. I am the Strawberry Commission representative on that committee. Today, my comments will be somewhat brief and based on previous discussions among the AAC on this issue. As you know, the AAC meets monthly, okay? The final EIR and staff report was issued after our May meeting, and unfortunately, we have not had an opportunity to convene our committee to properly discuss this issue. So, with that said, the AAC assembled a comprehensive letter outlining what we feel were some fundamental flaws in the draft environmental impact report. And we included, information on potential impacts to the viability of farmland in the county as a result of some of the proposed mitigation measures. After all, that is the mission of the Ag Advisory Committee. Overall, we were disappointed with the response, the comments on the issues we raised within that draft EIR. We felt, the comments were generally dismissive of what we feel are very valid concerns. I won't go into all the details. I think Claire provided a very good overview of our positions on some of the mitigation measures and the impacts of that, and some of the alternatives that we set forth. But I do want to say this, right? Hoops are just as important in the ag landscape as farmhouses, as vineyards, as grazing cattle. They look different, but it's part of an ag operation. It's an important part, and it's part of the future. We continue to contend also that hoops are less of a structure, and they're more of a tool, really. We disagree with labeling it as a development. If a farmer sells his land or moves on to something else, the hoops are gone. It's not like you're putting up a house or you're putting up, a structure that increases the value of the land. It's a tool you're using for the crop that's in the ground at the time, right? So we do support, the county's objectives to simplify and streamline the permit process for hoop structures and shade structures to allow farmers the flexibility and efficient ag operations in support of the county's ag economy. The proposed ordinance amendment and the limited permit exemptions, in our opinion, does little to simplify and streamline. If you look at attachment F, the flow chart from the staff report, I commend the staff. This is easy to follow. All right. It puts it forth. It seems like it's simple, but if a grower can't meet one of these exemptions and they're kicked over to the permit, and there's a lot of paths leading to a permit, in reality, that grower, that farmer is not going to have the ability to use hoops on his land, because the likelihood that he's going to pursue a permit process that could be very costly, could take a long amount, could take a long time, for a crop, the likelihood that he'll be able to do that is very small. It just, the economics don't work out. So, there are paths for permits, but I just don't think it's something that's going to be workable for the farmers. We need to really take a look at what some of these exemptions are. And, I think what Claire set forth, the alternatives, it would be really great if the staff can incorporate that into the report. So I ask you today to direct staff to prepare an ordinance amendment that more closely fulfills the original intent of the Board of Supervisors. I feel the current range of alternatives is much too narrow. I'm confident that if the staff comes back to the AEC, we will gladly provide some guidance on alternatives that can be both supportive of agriculture and be supportive of the stated objective of the project. So
great.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jason. Chase Reno.
Okay, good morning, Commissioners. So my name's Chase Renoir, and I'm here representing Driscoll's Strawberry Associates, who's a fresh marketer and seller of strawberries, raspberries, blackberries, and blueberries throughout California and on the East Coast and Mexico as well. So we're a family-owned company. We have been for generations, and we're a marketer and seller of fresh fruit for local family farmers throughout Santa Barbara County, Monterey County, and also Ventura County as well too. And I'm here on behalf of the grower, who we feel like some of these ordinances would significantly impact property and land that these growers own or lease on an annual basis. The ordinance that have been set forth, we feel like are very rigid and very stringent. I don't think it's within the spirit and the intent that the Board of Supervisors had, as far as something being really straightforward and easy to understand. Not all growers can fit into this one-size-fits-all box. This is agriculture. We're outside. We've been doing this for generations, and things of this nature are just not simple and easy necessarily to follow. The biggest thing is the hardship, especially on the setbacks. On a small family farm, you know, of 5 or 10 acres, these setbacks would significantly impact the footprint of their production agriculture, which we all know the landscape of agriculture in the state of California is obviously being challenged significantly going forward. So what I would like to recommend and support is creating ordinances that are more realistic and applicable for agriculture within the Santa Barbara County area. So thank you for your time.
Thank you. Brian Gresser.
Other commissioners. Brian Gresser, farm strawberries, blueberries, and blackberries here in Santa Maria Valley. And basically, the top 4 to me all affect ranches that I have right now. Between the height of the hoops, we have stuff that's already over 12 feet. As Claire said, some of it's for the harvesters, some of it's for the different crops on different temperatures we want, or the wind movement, or whatever we see for whichever crops under there. So I don't see where the county telling us how to farm is going to help us. The setbacks make a lot of the ranches that we already farm unfeasible, and we'd have to give them up, farm something different that we don't farm. You know, we don't go to an attorney and say, you know, you're a law attorney, or a state attorney, now you should be a family law attorney. But the county wants us to do that.
Brian, can I interrupt you? I have a question for you, if I could.
Yeah.
If we had a 20-foot setback, would that be objectionable? And I'll tell you why I bring that up. I do know that I travel on A Street and Black Road and some of those areas occasionally, and I see sometimes the black
wind fence
breaks, and they're like 5 feet in the roadway, and I can't see around the damn corner for cars coming the other direction. I'm just wondering, would a 20-foot setback, especially on roadways where we got intersections, would that cause you any kind of a problem?
Well, for the most part, we put 20-foot setbacks for roads, but the wind fences, or if we're like that, we'll get close to the road because the dust of the trucks and cars affect the crops. But us personally, in most of the spots where our cars are coming out, we lower that fence because we've had wrecks before. Okay. But so those wind fences that you're talking about, we put on the property line so that we don't lose property, but it's because of the dust.
But if you had hoop houses 20 feet away, then I don't have the hoop house blocking my view of the other roadway there.
Correct.
Okay,
yeah.
that answers my question.
Yeah, yeah.
So continue. I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, that's fine. And then just that, so what were the other ones? The setbacks, yeah, so it's going to change a lot of the ranches where we can't use them or use a big portion of the ranches, which makes it not usable or unfeasible. What else were the other ones from? Flood zones, we already have hoop houses in flood zones, so that would be out. Then the 5-year exemption, you know, I already have ranches that have been in for 2 or 3 years, so we have hoops, so now we can't farm them. And as Claire mentioned, a lot of it's for the organic production, because otherwise, to get in organic ground, it has to be farmed organically 3 years, or already not farmed. So that's where we can take lands that aren't already cultivated and make into organic ground. So, you know, so we need the flexibility to be able to farm how we see fit for our operations is basically how I see it, and they're just tools to help us produce better.
Thank you. Commissioner Brown has a question for you, then Commissioner Freeney does.
Thank you. I enjoy eating strawberries and blueberries that come from this area if I can find them. I can't always find them. Sometimes they're from Mexico. It's all those Driscolls that are grown in Mexico. Anyway, but I like to, if I can, get them from here. A question on growing in flood zones, because staff indicated there is this requirement already that there's this process that has to be undertaken if you're growing in a floodway. And from what I'm hearing is that people aren't observing that requirement.
Well, I don't know what their definition of flood zone is. My definition is that occasionally in big storms, the area will flood, and we put some hoops in there.
Okay.
It just, the water comes up and it's gone, and that's the risk we take by putting them there.
I see. So if you had a parcel of land where you had not farmed before, do you check to see if there's certain regulations like Ms. Wyman said about the Endangered Species Act compliance, that you would check to see whether or not there's these requirements that you have to meet before you start cultivating or thinking about farming?
The only ones that I know about are if it's a salamander pond, and that's like known that you have to stay away from that. But other than that,
Okay, so that's kind of something that's hard and fast for.
And I
you
also,
your guys.
in that big photo, I got a lot of acres in there that I wouldn't be able to farm under hoops all of a sudden, that we've been farming for 25 years.
Yeah. And do the feds ever come out to you and say, we've got salamander ponds here and we want you to do they ever talk?
Not to me, but I know to the landlords they have.
I see. So do the landlords talk to you about that and
Yeah.
say, oh, they do? Okay.
Yes.
So that's a well-known thing that you have to do certain things. And are you doing those?
Yeah, we have to avoid them. The
You
salamander
avoid
ponds.
the ponds, okay.
What is the, I mean, I think we all get confused on this. I know, especially when it comes to the oil projects. I think I heard last time if you were 2,700 feet is the range that the salamander might go to. And so if you have land that might possibly be habitat for them within 2,700 feet, that's the problem. That 1.4 miles is new. I don't know where that came from.
Yeah, that's
but you're
the first
telling
time
me
I've
what
seen
you're
it.
basically doing is if you have a pond that's got salamanders in there, you're careful to leave them alone. But you're not. And I think the state is confusing us, the feds are confusing us by talking about potential habitat as opposed to known habitat. Do I have that something right?
Yeah, I'm not a biologist, so I'm just told to stay away from
the
that area, and
ponds.
that's it. You know,
Okay.
I don't know what it's considered.
Where's your Freeney?
Thank you for coming today and helping us. Just technically a little bit, if we could talk about a 12-foot high hoop, and how wide is that normally?
I got them anywhere from 18 wide to, what do I got, 27 wide.
All with a 12-foot height?
Well, no, I got different variations in heights.
So what I'm trying to get is sometimes a wider hoop is a taller hoop and a narrower hoop is a lower hoop?
Sometimes, but I have both. You know, I have
And then
variations.
Does that
depending on the
have to
crop.
do with the plant spacing that you need for that particular crop? On how wide
the
your
plant
hoop
spacing,
is?
then also being east side of town compared to west side of town. West side, I want it to be a little warmer, so I lower them. East side, I want them to be a little cooler.
So you
I
have
raise them.
multiple of variables that determine the height of the hoop.
Correct.
Okay.
Yep.
And it has to do with plant spacing, or plant population.
Yep. Plant
so
spacing.
not just air circulation. There's a lot going. You have a lot of moving parts you're dealing with.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay. Would it be fair to say that a 12-foot tall hoop is about $12,000 and a 15-foot high hoop is about $15,000, about $1,000 a foot?
Depending on the metal cost that year you buy them, yeah.
So you're not running out then wanting to put up 15-foot high hoops just to spend more money?
No,
It's
not for fun.
'cause
No.
The parameters of the crop require that?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
All right. Thanks for playing.
All right. Thank
Brian.
you.
Thanks, Brian. Doreen Miller.
Hi. Thank you for listening to us today. My name is Doreen Miller, as you spoke, and I represent Rancho La Vina. It's a family-run farm in Lompoc. It's about 3,000 acres. It's been in existence since the 1860s. And there's just 3 issues I think that they want me to bring to your attention. Under the hoops, we do have various crops, walnuts and vineyards, and open field agricultural land, as well as hoop structures. So we're diverse, and the hoop structures really help us specifically with frost protection. And under the hoops, we grow heirloom tomatoes and winter squash. Those are the primary crops. And so let me just address a couple of issues here. This is my first one. Forgive me, I'm not used to speaking in public. The first point is the county's definition of outside of the floodway. This is on the MMWR-1, crop protection structures within floodway. To us, the definition appears to be arbitrary, based on aerial photos that perhaps are outdated, not actually surveyed. In our case, as an example, the boundary of the floodway, the blue line, actually crosses a live stream. So on one side should be outside the floodway, and yet it crosses a stream. And that's just a note I wanted to make on that. The next point is on the Bio2, the minimum 1 foot gap between the ground and the plastic cover. Again, I stated that we use the hoop houses for frost protection, and it's very significant between the months of between October and April. It requires that our plastic go all the way to the ground in order to be effective. So the requirement of having the 1 foot gap there would make it impossible for us to farm the way that we've been farming for the past decade. Excuse me. The third point I'm just going to make briefly. It's on the alternative 1. There is the recommendation of 100 feet from native plant communities. We have quite a large stretch of land that is south of Santa Rosa Road, and if this language is adopted, it would mean that we would not be able to put hoops within 100 feet of the southern boundary of all of our fields that are south of Santa Rosa Road there. We currently do have some hoop houses, and we have some walnut orchards there. We're concerned that the hoops are being treated differently from other setbacks. They're treated differently for setback purposes than other cropping techniques. And we don't understand the purpose for this additional requirement on the hoops. And that's all.
Great, thank you. Next will be Andy Rice.
Good morning. Hopefully you can hear me. My name's Andy Rice. I'm work for Ryder Berry Farms here in Santa Maria. Come from a long-time farming family. I'm 5th generation. They came sometime in the 1860s. So been here a long time, and I've seen a lot of changes. And not that I'm that old, but I have a lot of stories from my father and my grandfather, and stories back from my great-grandfather. And one thing I know is that ag is ever-changing, and we have to be able to adapt. And if you go back to the 1800s, you know that Santa Maria started in sugar beets and all kinds of things, and transitioned into vegetables, and then eventually into strawberries, and now into caneberries. The hoops are just our most recent adaptation to an ever-changing environment. So the ability to modify our practices and change with the current environment is critical. With labor constraints, water constraints, limited resources, all of these changes are something that will continue. And the current, as Brian Gresser said, the hoop structures that you see now aren't necessarily the hoop structures that you're going to see in 2 years or 5 years or 10 years from now, because they're ever changing too. And we've only been using them for the last probably 15 to 20 years, even more recently in Santa Maria. And we continue to adapt those to what we need: the height, the width, the makeup, the thickness of the metal, the different plastics, the shade of the plastic, the percent shade. All of those things continue to change based on our needs and based on the windows that we're trying to hit, the pricing that we're trying to hit, making it appealing to our labor force. All of those things are taken into consideration. And so there's one thing that is very consistent in agriculture, and that is the fact that we will continue to change, and we have to, or else we simply won't have a business here. On just to hit a couple, I know a lot of these have been said already, a couple of the importance of tunnels. They allow farmers to adapt to weather, labor, and resource constraints. They allow for a somewhat controlled growing environment. This is not a greenhouse. It's a hoop structure that helps minimizes some of the impacts of weather, but it doesn't completely control it, but it does assist. So it helps make a very, very changing environment a little bit more stable. It's an appealing environment to employees. And without hoops, we have to be very clear. Without hoops in Santa Barbara County, and I know we're not saying we're going to eliminate them completely, but if we make it that much more difficult to utilize them, and growers opt not to, there will not be raspberry production, there will not be blackberry production, there will be very minimal blueberry production, and the future of strawberries is greatly in question. So to be very clear, that's what we're talking about if you eliminate our ability to use hoops in Santa Barbara County. So again, going over the issues, some of the issues just really quick, the setbacks, we all know from a farming standpoint, they create all kinds of problems from a landowner perspective, from a grower perspective. There's lost rents, there's reduced rents, there's contractual obligations. If a grower goes into a lease and then finds out that we can't use hoops around a certain area, there's all kinds of financial restrictions that would jeopardize the business. The 1 foot gap from the height up to the bottom of the plastic, that minimizes our ability to control that environment. So we actively manage our tunnels, the plastic on the tunnels daily, depending on what the weather's doing. A day like this, we vent because pollination on raspberries is so critical that you get a day like this where it's high humidity, the bees aren't coming out, you have to vent to allow for air movement. Then you bring the plastic back down. You may bring them back up the next day, bring them back down. So it's actively managing that and restricting these height limitations and whatnot minimizes our ability to control that environment. So we want to close it off to create a warm environment. We want to lift it up to create air movement and increase pollination. Again, the intensely farmed land limitation, going back to the organic argument, there's a lot of ground in Santa Maria that's been brought into the intensely farmed sphere over the last several years because people were searching for organic. You eliminate that and take that away, you're pulling a lot of potential ground out of the system. So the proposed ordinance is simply not feasible or reasonable. I know I'm out of time, to allow farming families like mine to continue to adapt to an ever-changing environment. We all want to see farms work in parallel with our communities, and for generations, and I mean generations, we have. For 150 years we have. But these standards are jeopardizing our ability to have a viable operation in Santa Barbara County. So I respectfully request that the Commission take additional time to amend the proposed plans, and I hope that you work with growers while doing so.
Great, thank you. Alexandra Allen. I got here, okay. Lisa Bedrogi.
Good morning, Chairman Blau, members of the Commission. My name is Lisa Bedrogi, and I'm with Cultivated Connections. It's my company, and I've been representing agriculture for nearly 20 years in Santa Barbara County. First, I'd like to thank the farmers in the room, without which we would not eat. They work very hard every day to continue to provide food on our table. And they're continuing to have to do more with less. They're continuing to have to keep up with a growing population to provide that food worldwide, with less water, with less land, and less labor. They cannot take on more regulation. Hoops have been and are, in my definition, and as many of the speakers have said this morning, are a tool in agriculture. They're a piece of equipment. They help our farmers to be efficient in farming and do more with less. They need innovation. They need to be adaptable. Your previous speaker, Andy Rice, said it quite well. He put it out there bluntly to you. They need innovation and tools to continue to do what they're doing. So how did we get here? We got here because the ordinance has in the criteria of definition and permit requirements, there be a permit path for greenhouses. The ordinance also has a definition for hoop structures that are not greenhouses, specifically saying so. But it became this issue of, do we need to regulate hoops? So I believe we don't need to regulate hoops. Hoops are, again, an agricultural equipment. It's a part of agriculture. Agriculture has not historically been a requirement of permits subject to CEQA because of the fact that agriculture is a resource under CEQA. Staff, I want to thank staff, actually. They did the right thing about a year ago when the director issued a substantial conformity and said, yes, you know, hoops are an ag equipment. They are not subject to permit. And what happened? Unfortunately, the clause came out. Pardon the pun, but that's what happened. The county was, the issuance of the determination by the director was appealed by clause, and this issue of legal requirements in CEQA raised its ugly head. And so here we are trying to accommodate a CEQA document that actually says ag is an impact on ag, and ag is bad for the environment, when in fact ag is a part of the environment. And if we don't have ag and we push ag out, we will have much greater detrimental effects on the environment and our economy, I'd like to add. And it does take the ability to sustain our agricultural lands, and I hate to say it, farmers need to make money. It's not greed, it's a reality. We all need to make money. And if they can't afford to maintain their land and produce the food under the threats and the resource depletion that they're faced with, they're not going to be able to stay in farming. And then those lands around us will be converted to development, the only other choice. So I leave you with this, and you know, we've been very I guess maybe appreciative or really not recognizing the fact, because agriculture is our #1 economy and it's been growing over the years. We are in a billion-dollar industry, but in the last 3 years, check out your crop reports. Ag is starting to drop. We have had a decline in our agricultural dollar value. So we have to do more to help protect ag as a viable resource under CEQA. Thank you.
Thank you. That was my last speaker slip. Did I miss anybody by chance in Santa Barbara? Do I have other people out here that want to speak that didn't turn a speaker slip in? Okay, not seeing any. Before we go to deliberations, do we need a short break? Yes. We're going to take a short break and be back in about 10 minutes. Thank you all. We're going to go back on the record. So we're at a point now where we could ask staff additional questions, if you have any. Okay. I do have one question. I'm a little. I'm trying to figure out why we would need to do anything different in a floodway, whether we have a hoop house or not. What happens in the flood where the hoop structure is somewhat detrimental to other property or people, or I don't get it.
Chair Blau, members of the commission, so obviously I don't work for the flood control district, and if you want more of a technical analysis, we'd have to continue and invite them in to provide an answer. But what I will say is what I do know is in these situations, although the structures themselves aren't so much of a problem, what happens is they get ripped up, they go downstream, and then they get hit by a barrier, and that forms an obstruction, which forms an obstruction from something else, that forms an obstruction of something else, and it starts to build up, and it collects debris, and then you have implications from the floodway spilling now around those structures. So it's the actual lifting. You could have a flooding event, rips them out of the ground, sends them downstream, and you're just sending more debris down that can develop and back up in the floodways. So that's the main concern. But we have a number of responses to a number of the items and questions that were raised if we're afforded the opportunity to respond to those.
That'd be great.
Cool. So,
Mr. Chair, can I just follow up on that, to ask a question? So that is the main issue, is about the debris dams that may result from hoops being in flood ways?
Commissioner Brown, that's my understanding, because there's not too much displacement of water from the structure itself.
Right.
But when it's lifted up and it gets slammed into something else, which creates the debris.
And has that been a problem in the past? That's been a problem for flood control?
Yeah, that's a general concern just across the board. That's a general flooding consideration that they always take in consideration.
But that's with hoops specifically?
Hoops, yes. So that is one type of structure they would be concerned about. So,
Commissioner Freeney, go ahead.
Well, I thought her question was, have they specifically had problems with hoops and hoop material at flood control? Is it a specific issue, or is this a what if?
Commissioner Farini, through the chair, we have not had specific comments from flood control about this being an issue. However, we did discuss the regulations with the flood control district and their regulations regarding with what is allowed and how it's allowed within a floodway comes from the FEMA. The floodway locations, the mapping of the floodway comes from FEMA. So it's not. That's not even local. It is federal regulations that our local floodplain management ordinance implements.
I guess we could invite flood control in. I'm just having great difficulty understanding how water going through a farm field, even if it's got hoop structures covering part of the farm, is somehow going to be uprooted by the flood going through there. I mean, I don't get it. I think the question was, has there ever been a problem with hoops in a floodway? I think the answer is no. There may be one, but I think you're stretching. It's just my thoughts. But anyway, why don't you go ahead and continue if you want to address some of the public comment.
Mr. Chair, members of the commission, we'll try to respond to some of the comments that we have heard this morning. We did have one comment about lighting within hoop structures, and we just wanted to make it very clear that this ordinance regulating hoop structures and shade structures does not allow lighting within any of these structures. So it's straightforward and simple. Regardless of county regulations, any ag operator must still comply with the Endangered Species Act, whether the California or federal act, with regards to whatever requirements may occur if there are California tiger salamanders or other endangered species located on a property.
So the question raises itself. So is there any reason to further address that in this ordinance? If it's already covered by state and federal law, why do we need to burden ourselves or the farming community with any further regulations, permit processes or otherwise?
Chair Blau, members of the commission, that is because CEQA tells us we are required to do so. One of the obligations that we have when we prepare an EIR is that we must consult the trustee agency, which in this case is the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. We're also required to consult the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and coordinate with them with regard to the environmental analysis of this project. And although they ultimately have the responsibility for enforcing those laws, our mitigation measures are supposed to be designed to comply with those laws and enable them to make whatever approvals or decisions they have to make such that their decisions will comply with federal and state law.
Mr. Brown.
We didn't get any letters from those agencies, did we, for the EIR?
Commissioner Chair, Commissioner Brown, yeah, good question. So we consulted early on with both the California Department of Fish and Wildlife and U.S. Fish and Wildlife. They did not submit formal comment letters in the end, but they did in response to the notice of preparation for the EIR. So we heard from them early on. We got the direction, not only in the form of the letter submitted in response to the notice of preparation, but then also we spoke with both of the Fish and Wildlife agencies to get guidance on a number of issues. Everything from, for example, related to CTS, California tiger salamander, and then really what is the impact and how do we enable farmers to continue doing the farming operations with minimal impacts yet still comply with the Endangered Species Act and not have them get in trouble with the Endangered Species Act, because that's one thing we always want to keep in mind. We don't want to lead farmers down the path of believing that they comply with our regs and they're good to go for all of the regulations. You always must comply with federal and state law, regardless of what our local permitting requirements are. So this gets back to the original question about the history of active cultivation on a site and whether or not somebody could just go ahead and plow over a CTS habitat and plant row crops. They could do so, but probably to the detriment, because that may get them in trouble with the California and U.S. Fish and Wildlife agencies for non-compliance with the Endangered Species Act. So that law applies regardless of our permitting requirements.
So back to the issue of this 1.24 miles. I was just looking at the state's letter, and I didn't really read it. I'm sorry I didn't, because I think it would have been helpful. But I don't see that numerical standard in here. Was that just through your personal discussion? Is it in this letter? Just trying to look for some more information on that, because it speaks broadly about complying with regulations, but
Commissioner Brown, through the chair, I believe that was from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and we got that number in a phone call.
Ah, okay. So, all right. So it would have been helpful if we had something in writing. Thank you.
Regarding the question about historic cultivation, I know that there were some growers that were concerned that they would no longer be able to farm some of their properties that they've been farming the last 2 or 3 years. And I think the intent with the historic cultivation for the exemption is to specifically allow those cultivated fields ongoing to continue and without any concerns regarding the placement of a new structure over those fields. So if you've been growing for 25 years, if you've been cultivating a field, that field is historically intensively cultivated, and you can put up hoop structures without with an exemption, without any concerns regarding that particular issue. With regards to visual impacts, we do want to again emphasize it's from public roadways and public viewing areas, and other public viewing areas include places like a public park. So it's a place where the public actually goes and spends time at, that is a public property, not a private property. We're not requiring any kind of mitigation from private properties. And then we've also had comments about the economic impact to agriculture, but none of the commenters have presented us with any information or data as to what that economic impact might be. How much of a financial impact would it be? So we would need more information to understand that particular comment. We'd also like to reiterate that we have gone through a public process. We have consulted with growers since, I think even before I was involved on this project. There were some site visits that our deputy director attended with some other planners. And then we have reached out to the growers and attended the Ag Advisory Committee and have been keeping them up to date on the progress with the project and what we're proposing. We've gone through the public process with the notice of preparation and also environmental hearings for the draft environmental impact report. We held hearings both here in Santa Maria and in Santa Barbara for both the notice of preparation and the draft EIR environmental hearings, but we only received interest from community members here in the North County who attended our hearings here. We didn't have any attendees in the South County. Anything further from the team?
Mr. Chair, and I just wanted to respond to, I think early on, Commissioner Farini had a couple of questions. One of those was relating to the county's adoption of the Ag Buffer Ordinance. And the Ag Buffer Ordinance the county adopted several years ago had a different intent, and the intent and the applicability is different than what is being discussed here. The Ag Buffer Ordinance applies to non-agricultural development that is either within an urban area immediately adjacent to agriculture, and it's placing the restrictions and the setbacks on that non-ag development within the urban area, essentially to provide that buffer so that normal ag activities that are occurring in agriculture aren't being burdened with that restriction or placement in terms of nuisance issues from noise and dust, et cetera. So that ordinance is specific for those non-agricultural development activities. As Ms. Harris was mentioning in her presentation, the EIR analyzed the impacts of the project, which is the structure, the hoops and crop protection structures, not the agriculture. And so it's looking at the physical impacts from that structural development. It's not looking at the physical impacts of the continuing either cultivated or grazing or the agricultural activities themselves. And so the distinction in terms of both the mitigation that is being incorporated as development standards applies to the structural development, not the agricultural cultivation activities. I think those were the other questions, but certainly we're available to answer additional questions you may have.
I'm not seeing any lights lit up, so I'm going to just venture in slightly into deliberations, and if other commissioners have more questions, we can certainly ask those. At least for me, I'm not sure I understand the reasoning behind doing an environmental impact report on this project. I didn't need an expert to tell me that hoop houses are ugly if you're driving down the highway. They're not a pretty sight. I mean, you know, they're not attractive. And I don't see where any setback or any height restriction makes any difference to that. I mean, if you want to be able to grow berries successfully as a farmer in this area, you have to use hoop structures. I'm also of the I mean, I can't even understand why we're having any kind of a permit process at all. It seems to me if we have a set of rules that say it can't be more than 20 feet in height, I'm in favor of a 20-foot setback from roadways for the site distances I think you need for automobiles. I heard from the farmer community that does not put a burden on them. I don't understand this 100-foot from setback from native vegetation. How does growing a crop that's completely controlled and cultivated adjacent to native vegetation create any kind of a problem? I don't need financial impact report to tell me that if I burden the farmer with additional restrictions and additional procedures and additional permitting processes, it's going to cost him money and it's going to have a negative financial impact. I get that. That's not difficult to understand. The 1 foot gap, I think, this is one of the meetings where I really did learn a lot from the public testimony. I mean, no more about hoop house and farming than I ever thought I needed to know, but that part was good. So I'll see what my fellow commissioners feel, but I think we can make this very simple. Send it back to the board and say, if you're 20-foot setback, if you're less than 20 feet in height, there's no permit required. And I certainly understand the idea of a permit process that's one way for 20,000 square feet and one that's for over 20,000 square. 20,000 square feet is less than a half acre. I mean, that's not kind of a farm operation at all. Maybe if you grow lavender or some really high density or high impact value crop, but not very big. But I don't get that. I don't get that at all. So for me, that's where I'm at. Commissioner Park.
Yeah, I have some similar viewpoints, maybe a little different in some ways. So I'd like to address some mitigation measures that I don't really like. But first, I'd like to make some general comments. You know, I grew up going on summers to Grandma's farm where my mother grew up, and I love that farm. It was a beautiful little white farmhouse and surrounded by cottonwoods, and we'd have draft horses and sheep everywhere and three-legged dogs and all the things you have when you grow up on a farm. And, you know, and a little farm-all tractor, not one of these big enclosed things and all that. And you know, when I buy a calendar every Christmas, I get one that has pictures of little farms like that. But, you know, preserving agriculture is not preserving my vision of what Grandma's farm was. Preserving agriculture is preserving an entire agricultural community, which includes the land, and it includes all those crazy entrepreneurs that are willing to take all the risks they do, and employ all the thousands of people that they do, all those agricultural workers, and supporting the enormous agricultural support industry that we have in this county. And preserving agriculture, of course, is important for those people and for the economy, but it's important for things like carbon sequestration and having a certain look to our landscape that's different than what it would look like if we had no agriculture. Again, it doesn't need to look like Grandma's farm. It can't really to succeed. And yes, hoop houses have a certain look to them. But I think that my view of hoop houses isn't so much from how close it is to a certain roadway I'm on. I might be on a hill and see a whole sea of them out there. And maybe you like them and maybe you don't as a visual impact. But if we're not going to be able to vote to have none at all. We're not going to vote to have Grandma's farm. It's not going to work. So now we look at our mitigation measures. I think mitigation measures, they best honor an environmental concern by taking it seriously, and I think you take an environmental concern seriously by having mitigation measures that are calibrated to address that problem. And mitigation measures should be founded in science, and if not science, in other evidence, and if not in other evidence, in logic. I just find a lot of these mitigation measures here to be extremely arbitrary. I don't know where they come from. The 75 feet from public roads. I don't think that it matters. I don't care whether they're 20 feet or 100 feet or 500 feet. I don't think it makes any difference to me or to the public. So I don't think we need that 75-foot setback. I think it's just a problem that we create for agriculture without really solving anything. The 400 feet from urban township lines, I see the same thing. It's sort of an imaginary buffer that's backwards from the policy we already have for buffer zones. I don't think it really protects anybody, and I wouldn't favor it either. The 3 of 5 years for intensive cultivation, for that definition, I kind of see where they're going there, but I don't think it really serves anything with this definition. You know, I'm most interested personally in native plant communities. I can see land that was cultivated 50 years ago from the way it's graded and so forth. So I don't see anything magic about 3 out of 5 years. I think it's just going to create problems. The 1 foot separation from ground to the bottom of a hoop structure or the plastic, I don't see any science that tells us that we have to have a foot. I mean, is it like the little gecko lizard and he stands up on 2 feet and he walks through and he's a foot tall? I mean, I know that sounds silly, but there's nothing here that tells us it needs to be a foot. Why 1 foot's different than 3 inches or 1 inch or a ½ inch, or even any science that tells us that when the salamanders go from their burrows where they live and it rains, and then they're going to migrate out to the ponds where they collect for breeding, whether they're going to go through this kind of agriculture or not, whether that's you've got the plastic sheeting a foot high. So it just seems arbitrary. And finally, I'd address the floodways. If we were looking at that slide, if it's easy to get to, I'd appreciate that being put up, but maybe it is or isn't. We see that most of the land we're concerned about there is western Lompoc Plain, and it's about half of that whole area, so it's a big piece. Let's be practical. Think about where these hoop houses, if we get a big enough flood that goes through that whole plain and washes away that plastic, where it's going to pile up. Is it going to pile up against a bunch of houses out there? No, there are no houses west of those lands. What's west of those lands is more agriculture, and finally you get to that big lagoon before you get out to the sea. So I don't think we have a public safety problem we need to address by keeping plastic sheeting outside of that floodway. So those are my concerns. Those are things I don't like, that I think are mitigation measures that I don't really think mitigate anything and just cause problems for agriculture.
Commissioner Freeney.
As usual, Commissioner Park put it better than I could, and I appreciate that. So it seems that we need to develop a pathway then for this to move forward. Does it go back? One of the concerns is Ag Advisory Committee put significant work, effort, thought, and heart into their responses, and the way Mr. Charette explained it was because of how their meetings are timed, they never really got to see full fruition of their work. They never got to comment on whatever comments were made on their comments. So it would seem to me that it shouldn't have been here yet. There should have been some courtesy extended to them from our department to them, acknowledging their work and effort. I wouldn't be opposed to postponing, delaying, whatever you know, and giving them a shot at it and putting their comments in the record. From there, it seems that this document does not give the Board of Supervisors an opportunity to look at, here again, I'm not the best, so this world needs some help, but significant and unavoidable impacts, I think, is what a lot of these things are that, as Commissioner Park said, then have what seem like arbitrary mitigation measures put up that don't really address the problem. The hoops are still going to be there. So that would be, we would include that as one of their options so that they would have the opportunity to vote on what they asked us to send them. And I think that was discussed earlier on what the true motion was, and that it was a streamlined, simple effort would be 20 feet and under is exempt, and no, that just seemed like what they asked for. So I don't know how mechanically to make all of that happen, and maybe we can try.
Let's hear from Commissioner Brown and Commissioner Cooney before we try and decide how we're going to move this forward. Commissioner Brown.
Thank you. I want to appreciate all the agriculturalists coming today. It's always really helpful to hear from you because I live in the urban area and the ag in where I live is totally different than the ag here. So it's very helpful and informative to get your viewpoint and information about the agricultural issues. I would just like to ask staff about the Bio 3 setbacks from streams and creeks, because in your slide presentation, you indicate that the 100-foot setback is to achieve consistency with several policies and development standards in the comprehensive plan. Can you just speak to that momentarily?
Commissioner Brown, through the chair. There are a number of policies and development standards throughout the comprehensive plan that talk about providing setbacks and reasonable setbacks of structures from streams and creeks. And typically in the urban areas, those setbacks would be 50 feet. And typically in rural areas, those setbacks would be 100 feet. So the purpose of this mitigation measure is to achieve policy consistency, essentially, so that if they meet those setbacks, if they just place their hoop structures that distance from the streams and creeks, then they are complying with the policy and they can be exempt and there's no issues with the use of the structure.
So these standards were probably written for permanent structures, barns, houses. I'm trying to get a sense of what they were written for, because these were written some time ago. I know when we were doing the Eastern Goleta Valley Community Plan, it was about 50-foot setbacks, but it was never about considering any nature of development, if you will, that concerned this. It would seem to be it was about permanent structures. So I'm trying to understand the difference here between this sort of non-permanent structure that can be here today and not be here today. And having some appropriate setback. So can you speak to that, Dan, or can you speak to that, David?
Chair Block, Commissioner Brown, excuse me if I'm going to repeat what Ms. Harris just said, because I was talking with Ms. Campos while you're asking the beginning of your question. But yes, there's a number of considerations. One, I mean, it's not only just the direct impacts, but there are also indirect impacts. So one, for example, it's not just habitat removal that can have an impact, for example, on wildlife species. It actually could be human activity within proximity to, for example, wildlife movement corridors. Riparian corridors are one of the classic wildlife movement areas. The more activity, such as agricultural development or any other type of use within proximity to those areas, may impede wildlife movement and have an adverse effect. Second, there are indirect impacts from runoff. Also, many times, and I'm not necessarily saying it's the case in any specific location, but agriculturalists do tend to clear native vegetation around their crops out of concern that wildlife will inhabit their crops and possibly contaminate them. And there is a heightened concern about whether markets will accept products which have wildlife that have been in it, and concerns about contamination. So there's a number of things. Those are just a couple of examples where you can have impacts which it's not structural development like a new building going up, but there still are potential impacts that must be considered and evaluated.
Well, that raises a question, though. What difference does it make whether it's a row crop that's covered by a hoop house or one that's not covered by a hoop house? Are you now saying that farmers shouldn't grow any crops or do any cultivating within 100 foot of the stream beds? Because if you're saying that, that's one thing. When your last argument makes sense to me, but if you're telling me that the hoop house is causing the problem, I don't see the relationship.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's a challenging question, Chair Blau, and that's one that we grappled with early on in the analysis, because we got to be careful to distinguish between impacts from cultivation, which is currently allowed without a permit, and what is the actual effect of hoop structures. And the conclusions that we basically came to, based upon our research, is that except for the possible impediments to CTS migration, I know there's differences of opinion. We were basing our recommendations from what we were hearing from the respective wildlife agencies, and they're the ones who recommended the vertical clearance of 12 inches. Clearly, we're not going to come up with these numbers ourselves. We're going to go to the experts to find out about them. But it's important to find the causal connection, what is causing the impact to these streams. Under existing regulations, if you're going to do just cultivation, you still have to comply, for example, with water quality requirements, regional water quality control requirements. Setbacks will likely come into play. That's a typical requirement from the Regional Quality Control Board. The impacts of the hoop structures, the question we grappled with is, to what extent would this change in the permitting requirements, that is a reduction in permitting requirements, incentivize more hoop structures and consequently more cultivation? That's a difficult question to answer. You heard testimony today that was saying that when you increase the permit requirements, it's less likely you're going to see applications for development that is subject to those permit requirements. So following the reasoning out, you reduce the permitting requirements, are you going to see more hoop structures? More cultivation, more activity within proximity to those resources.
And Commissioner Brown, you want to take that on? Should I rip and tear on that for a minute?
Go ahead.
That you know, I want to say this. I used to tell a joke about the Socialist Soviet Republic of Santa Barbara, where they just really want to control everything. You can't do anything in this county without getting permission to do it. And your argument that you just gave me just sort of points that out. I mean, you're telling me you don't want more hoop structures in agriculture, and if you make the permitting process relatively easy and inexpensive, you're going to get more of it. Yeah, you're going to get more farming, you're going to get more crops, you're going to get more employment. Those are things, all the things that I'm sort of looking forward to having. And what I'm not looking forward to is creating a structure of permitting process that's going to inhibit them from doing their farming and cause them to not want to farm and not put up hoop structures or not do the high value crops. That's just contrary, I think, of what the supervisors gave us instructions to do. They said, go forward and make this process, you know, relatively easy to do. Yeah, I agree, you know, you want to not damage the environment, but from what I can see, the only adverse impact that I saw was the visual impact of the hoop houses. There is no way to mitigate that, and my opinion at all. I mean, the setbacks doesn't do it. I drive 101, and I take Santa Maria Way, and there's a few hoop houses on there. You use a stretch. There's nothing you can do to impact that at all. And to have a 5-foot setback or 100-foot or 200, silly. I mean, it doesn't do it. I get the 20-foot setback part, as Mr. Grant's been a problem. But for me, I don't see the relationship. The other,
I just want to make one explicit clear. It came up in the commentary. The last thing I want to do is farm to farm. Okay. And many presented to us about setbacks and dangers. When having complied with those, are not our regulations.
I get this. Okay. I get they're not yours.
So,
but
and getting to your comments, I want to be clear. When it's a visual, it's the board's discretion to reduce that. Those are visual impacts that are inherently subjective. I grew up in a farming community. Hoopsters are ugly, probably. But for those communities, locally, and I have to respect that. EQUIS says we've got to acknowledge that too. When somebody submits an argument with substantial evidence to how there's going to be an aspect on visual without redo the DR to impact, you are effectively saying ineffective to the biological impacts. The class 2 found significant to less than significant. And if you see things that were put into information from the trustee, that will likely warrant a recirculation of the EIR, because we would have to change the classification impacts to at least significant.
And I think what I'm disagreeing with you to list those requirements in there. What I'm disagreeing with is having any kind of a permit process, you pay a fee, and have staff give them permission to put those there. That's part of having great difficulty. I want salamander destroyed either, and that's not the issue here. But I also don't want to have here a 6-month or a 10-hour process to get permission to houses on their farm. Let's give them the rules. You know, we need to have giving permission to the farm. Mr. Brett, you next.
I would just like to thank you, Dan. I'm going to follow on with the bioresource. I was reading the letter from the state and concerning the response to the notice of preparation, and read it as not being the project. It's like that it's just a piece of vacant ground where nothing has ever occurred, and the requirements that have to be met. get some resolution on, because I'm sure like every other commissioner here, I think the preservation of and mitigations for these tiger salamanders is important. So I'm having some difficulty in coming to reconciling how do we regulate that, if we can regulate it, and the impacts to the farmers who've been farming this land for, in some cases, hundreds of years, 100 years or so, or a long time. Concerning the setbacks, I'm not for any setbacks. I'm only for whatever setbacks are currently in place. I think the visual resources are important. They've always been important to me, living in the urban area, which is a totally different issue than living in the agricultural areas, where, as you see in these wonderful paintings depicted here without any hoop structures, look at that beautiful ag over there, the Santa Maria Valley, how gorgeous that is. But that was done in a time where there weren't any hoop houses, weren't even anybody's imagination. And this great painting done by Ray Strong, who's a well-known artist, look at that, no hoop houses on them. But that's a different time and period, and it's me who has to adjust, I think, not the realities of the new agricultural practices. So I'm not for any of the setbacks on either Ag 1, in the urban areas, near the urban areas, in the Design D overlay in San Ynez Valley. I'm not for it, because I think as Ms. Weinman, the arbitrary numeric values won't provide additional protection of visual resources, and I don't think they will. I think we've long passed that period when the visual resource issues on ag lands populated by hoop structures is over. So I would have liked to have seen the Aggies to have had the Aggies had a chance, or AAC, to review this once more. I appreciate it's been out some time, but sometimes the formality of having it before them makes a difference to them and makes a difference to us. I understand and I appreciate the effort staff has made and the constraints that you're under to do the analysis here. And it's, I don't know, has it been helpful to look at these? I think that we probably would understand that there are some visual impacts. Bioresources are a whole different issue that we really don't, it's not something you can see, it's not a visual thing. But has been helpful to see what might be some mitigations, but I don't know how you do mitigations now on farmland that's been actively farmed and impose this requirement. Maybe there's some middle ground here. I'm not sure. For me, I would like to, I don't know where the commission's going, but it would be important for me to get more information on that. And I think that's the only piece that I really need more information on. Further discussion are about the bioresource impacts, but the others, no setbacks. I don't think they're practical.
Commissioner Cooney, I'm not sure who's next to you or Commissioner Freeney, but
yeah.
You have been quiet so far. Do you wish to go next?
I don't care about going next. If Commissioner Freeney wants to.
I think he's.
I just had a quick.
Oh, go ahead. Good.
Just a little blurb. So if we went back to Grandma's farm and there were chicken and eggs there, and the classic question was, what came first, the chicken or the egg? And so I think this goes to, if we look under the environmental review overview on your one of your statements is we did not analyze impacts of cultivation. And it's like, okay, so is that the chicken or the egg? Does the hoop house cause the issue, or did the cultivation cause it? So, and you can't have a hoop house unless you've cultivated. So you have to cultivate first to have a hoop house. You have to do all the cultivation to plant the crop. So when you look at Bio 2 and 3, and those are discussing exclusively based on the hoop house, and yet it's my opinion, and I think many others, is that the hoop house is accessory to, it's a non-permanent, I hate to even call it structure, it's a non-permanent tool that is used to, help grow a crop. As I have heard fellow commissioners say, it's not a house, it's not a barn, it's a tool. Okay, and it's not up and something's planted in it. It's put up over something to protect it, help bring that crop to market. So I think this not analyze, and I'm scared to death to hear about the analysis of impacts of cultivation on everything, because it's like, well, we know what cultivation is, right? It's chopping stuff up into little pieces. The thing that I think is important is there was a detonation that caused all of this, and prior to that detonation, I assumed, as did even in development, that hoops were exempt because they weren't prohibited. And then a year or two, it doubt that no, if it's not exclusively mentioned, it's prohibited. So there has been a long-term interpretation, I guess. So could you talk a little bit about the chicken and why cultivation is not relevant, but a hoop house is for Bio 2 and Bio 3?
So my understanding is you're asking why we don't analyze cultivation in this EIR?
Yeah, so because you are cultivating, we are cultivating, as
Yes.
we have done on this ground forever, and now we're putting a hoop up
passes.
after. So it's not like the hoop has caused this new use of the ground. The ground was already being used for this, but now it's been intensified with the use of the hoop. But I'm afraid that increment is not acknowledged in the EIR, because it's like, no, there's a hoop and it causes this, therefore set back a mitigable amount, right? But yet stuff was already going on there in that space.
Right. So the EIR does attempt to separate the impacts associated with cultivation from what is actually happening when a hoop goes up. Obviously, they're totally connected, and you don't really do one without the other. But since cultivation is exempt in the county, so that is kind of the baseline assumption. So really, the way it was viewed is, as these regulations could streamline, or were intended to streamline installation of hoops and continuation of the use of hoops in the county, the idea was that could support further growth and use of hoop structures in the county, which kind of gets to your chicken and egg argument. So we're not necessarily analyzing the impact of the cultivation of the ground, but the fact that more hoops could go on uncultivated land or on cultivated land and cause the impacts that are discussed in the EIR. Does that answer the question?
So it seems like the discussion about the hoop and its impact is based on a previously undisturbed piece of property, and I'm just walking up, and now I'm going to walk across here, bring my equipment in, and it's not really talking about, no, this is bare earth that's planted in a crop.
Right. It's talking about both.
Otherwise, I don't see how you have that impact with putting a hoop up on a piece of ground that is weed-free, right? And level and clean and has a crop on it, right?
Right.
And
So
a weed is any plant that's out of place, right? So we specifically plant a blueberry plant here. That is now becomes the crop. And anything else is the weed, but all the weeds, including the previous crop, even if it was broccoli, are now gone. Okay?
Right.
So it's brown tilled earth, not
Undisturbed.
Undisturbed.
Right. Yeah, and the EIR attempts to address both. It does. That's why there's the distinction between the historically cultivated land versus the not previously historically cultivated land. And the impacts on land that were previously cultivated, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think those are focused on visual. And then we do have some bio mitigation that kind of focuses on policy consistency with the comprehensive plan and, the solid waste impacts. I understand it is a bit of a chicken and the egg, and the AR attempts to separate those.
A little bit of gray there. Since you brought up the disposal, what did you call it?
Solid waste.
Solid waste. Do you know how much is that? Do you check that out in the EIR? How much of that is recycled?
We did do a lot of research regarding the solid waste issue, and a lot of the information came from discussions with farmers. And the plastic that is used in these crop protection structures, there's no market to recycle it at this time. From what we understand, about 5 years ago, there was a market. It was getting baled and shipped to China, and they would recycle it there. There used to be a program at the Santa Maria landfill to recycle agricultural plastic waste, but they shut it down because there was no one to take the plastic. So really, there was no feasible mitigation. The farmers, obviously, they don't want to take it to the landfill. It costs money. So if there is a recycling market, they will recycle it. And that's kind of a larger market issue that is beyond the scope of the project.
Mr. Cooney.
Well, it's certainly my initial comment that this has been very educational today. I came here concerned about the larger problem of how we deal with hoop houses in the county, because up to now, various spurts of various departments to regulate them have not been successful, and I think the Board of Supervisors was wise to initiate the process of creating an ordinance that specifically covers them, and in the usual manner carves out certain issues that are of concern that we're required to consider and deals with them. I'm sure the 5 of us here today, as well as the 5 supervisors, could all sit down and come up with a whole list of additional or easier to comply with mitigation measures, some that make sense to most. But that's not the process we're involved in, I don't believe. I think what we have to do is say, okay, either hoop houses are subject to regulation, or they're just like the farmer's plow and subject to the vehicle laws. Anybody ought to be able to put up a hoop house of any size if the interest is more successful agriculture. And that, we've moved past that. And Commissioner Blau, I hear you saying we shouldn't have any permits for hoop houses. And I think that was already the contention of farmers using hoop houses clear back before the Board of Supervisors considered this. So we're wasting a lot of time if what we do is say, take all these regulations out and just say, okay, define hoop houses. I think the ordinance does a good job of that. And just say there are no permits required if you have hoop houses of however great a size the landowner or farmer chooses. I thought we might be able to improve the ordinance when it came before the commission, but we can't do that if our conviction is There's no regulation that satisfies me. And, you know, I have to credit Ms. Weidman at the very outset, who spent some time saying, look, I've got members, I've got neighbors who don't feel any regulation is appropriate in this area. But what we're trying to do as an industry is work with the county and come up with limitations that work environmentally, that comply with concerns that are spelled out, and you know, we'd like to do it in a way that doesn't require redoing the environmental impact report. But hers was, I think, the reasonable approach, and it doesn't sound like my fellow commissioners are in that same place. I'm not sure about Commissioner Brown. I couldn't understand her position, and I don't want to characterize it, but it didn't sound to me like she agreed with some of the proposed mitigation measures. My choice now, given what I see, is we continue this matter. We give direction to staff to consider some modified mitigation measures that are within the context of the ones we have, so that it doesn't necessarily require amending or revising or going through a lengthy environmental process, and to what end if it isn't successful. I'm also concerned that if we don't do anything, if we basically say we're recommending that the board not regulate hoop structures, shade structures at all, that all we're doing is kicking the matter across the street to the Superior Court, where promptly, but not that promptly, we'll hear that we have to do what we are doing in terms of staff's proposal. So I don't love it. I don't love the mitigation measures. I agree we can do a better job of a 1-foot gap around every hoop house, but I would be prepared to support staff's recommendation and send this to the board as soon as we can.
Let me just respond by saying I am not opposed to the regulations that we're talking about. What I'm opposed to is the permit process. I mean, farmers, they have all kinds of regulations that they have to deal with now, especially when it comes to chemicals and other things that state things they have to comply with. They're used to being regulated, but the difference is having them go through a permit process through the county staff in order to use hoop houses. I have no problem saying, look, you've got to keep your hoop house 20 feet from the street. I have no problem saying it's a maximum of 20 feet in height. I've also got no problem saying it's some minor distance from bed street. You have to do that anyway now. So I'm not opposed to the regulations you want to impose. What I'm opposed to is another process where they have to fill out an application and go through the process of getting permission to do this from a county staff person. That's the part I'm adamantly opposed to.
Just to understand your position, are we basically saying that you would like to expand the exemptions so that that no permit is required, provided these regulations are
complied with?
Are complied with.
Exactly right. You put it perfectly, Commissioner Brown.
Well, I'm sorry I wasn't clear. I'm not clear because there's a lot of mush to me here. There's a lot. I think there's some. I think Miss, you hit the nail on the head, Commissioner Cooney. I think that we can improve this ordinance to have some limitations that work. And I just don't think. I think we're struggling with some of the issues, and I think that we can have an ordinance, but I don't think we're there yet.
Yeah, and I agree. And I actually think that I'd like to get consensus on this issue of permit versus no permit, but I also like the idea that this goes back to the Agricultural Commission and let them know that let them know what happened here today, what the discussion that we've had, and ask them to take a look again at these regulations, and let them come back and say, these are reasonable, these are not, or we want this one changed, and we can debate that. And if I get the consensus from the commission, the consensus from the farmers that we testified here today, I'm all for it. But I just don't want to see another set of bureaucracies that farmers have to go through in order to be able to farm. That's my number one priority. So having said that, Commissioner Perini, you are our resident farmer.
Hesitant
farmer?
Yeah, hesitant resident farmer.
So we'll let you make the first motion if no one objects.
I'll give it a shot. Okay, so the way I understand it, currently 12 feet and under are exempt from permit.
Commissioner Freeney, through the chair, the current ordinance, or I should say, the proposed ordinance would exempt any hoop structures that are 20 feet or less in height, 20 feet or less.
So right now, though, without an ordinance, and the 12 feet and under, where did that come from? Like, we still think that's exempt. It's not.
Commissioner,
is that what you're telling me?
Commissioner Farini, under the existing regulations, the existing land use and development code, there is no clear permit path or exemption for hoop structures. The table of allowed uses in the ag zone just doesn't show hoop structures or shade structures at all. And a strict reading of the LUDC, there's a section of the LUDC that says if you're not in the table identified as an allowed use, you're not allowed. So the very strict reading of the ordinance is they're not allowed. This ordinance will specifically allow them by putting them into that table, and they'll say you are allowed. So the current height exemptions that we have in the county code have to do with the building permit, and the building permit allows them to be used without a building permit if they're 20 feet or less in height. So the LUDC is trying to align with the building code's exemption in the proposed land use permit exemption.
So
that's
so in that spirit, that's where I would like to go then, is say if they're 20 feet or under, right, that they're allowed, okay, and that it's 20 feet from a roadway. And go ahead, help me.
Well, I think it's the issue largely of the setbacks here that we're having some trouble with.
That's right.
And I think that's probably the biggest issue from I hear from Commissioner Park. And
so I'm going to just throw it out. And
right.
Well,
no,
I think that's. We've got to come up with a motion and
well, I think the motion is to continue the item to a date that we'll pick, and have with instructions to staff to take it back to the Agriculture Commission, and then I think we could maybe weigh in on some others, like 4 or 5 major issues. You know, permit, no permit, setback, no setback, 20-foot setback, 50-foot, that sort of thing, and then let the Ag Commission come back.
Advisory committee
come back and give us their polished recommendations based on our discussion here today. And their meeting again.
That's easy.
Chair Blau, Commissioner Freeney, just to provide a little guidance, if I could jump in.
Good.
So what I'm hearing is that the motion could be to continue it, and talking to staff, it might be to continue this item to July 11th, if that works. And in the interim period, that's to direct staff to present these items to the Ag Advisory Committee with direction from this commission today to specifically look at the setbacks, the height requirements, and expanding potential exemption opportunities for permitting, and looking at these setbacks that we're having questions with. And so the motion then could be to continue that to July 11th, with the resolution, prepared to recommend to the board based on staff coming back with further information or clarification on the setbacks,
the bioresource
the heights, and what impacts do the changes to the mitigation measures have, and if that would trigger recirculation or not. Because I think Commissioner Cooney had indicated that working within the parameters of the existing mitigation measures may not trigger recirculation. However, if we start modifying too much or coming up with new mitigation measures, it could trigger further secret review. So that could help frame the motion.
I think that's a great motion. Okay. So moved.
Chair Blau, just to add on to that, or just to clarify, so specifically with regard to all the visual resource mitigation measures, we already said even with those mitigation measures, you have an unavoidably significant impact. So if you were to change those mitigation measures, it's not really going to change the conclusions of the EIR, and that would not trigger a recirculation. However, with regard to biological resources, those were found to be significant but mitigable to a less than significant level with the suggested mitigation measures. So if you remove those mitigation measures, you have to put something in its place which is equally as effective, if not more so, in order to avoid recirculating. I just want to make that clear so you're fully aware.
I'm not advocating at all about the mitigation measures for biological reasons, except for, I believe Commissioner Park is correct. There is no evidence in the record that's been provided to us that it makes a difference whether the plastic is a foot off the ground, inch off the ground, or on the ground. So that's the only one that I would probably disagree with. All the rest of the measures, I believe, are appropriate and should be included in the regulations. I'm just not wanting to do a permit.
Sure. And Chair Blau, if you do make any changes to those mitigation measures, we will do our very best to get the Fish and Wildlife folks to respond to us. As I mentioned earlier, they did provide commentary early on and gave us this guidance. They did not provide recent comments, so we can always go back to them and ask them about that.
And knowing that there is a significant problem with controlling the temperatures and the moisture within the hoop structures.
They're very well aware of that, actually. In our discussions with them, they know the benefits of hoop structures and for the agriculturalists. So
right. And is there some other way to mitigate the tiger salamanders other than raising up the plastic a foot? And I'll bet there is. I bet they'll figure out one. So we need a second on that motion. Commissioner Parks, did I hear you second the motion?
Actually, I just want to raise one more issue I'd like to see addressed. And we have this 20,000-foot divide, okay, that you've spoken about, Chairman Blau. And I think there's some ambiguity in the ordinance that ought to be clarified. Is 20,000 feet literally referring to a particular set of hoops and the plastic over that set of hoops? Or is it to the entire hoop structure assemblage on a given parcel? So if you have a 100-acre parcel and you only allow 20,000 square feet of hoop structures, that's really tiny, and that basically says you've got to go through and get a development permit for every parcel that has hoop structures. But if you count every single line of hoops with one sheet of plastic over it as a hoop structure, and you might say, well, this 5 acres has 15 hoop structures on it, and you come to a different viewpoint. And I can't tell from this ordinance just exactly what is a hoop structure. Is it that one set of hoops with the one set of plastic, and they're all side by side, or is it the whole thing? And I think we need to address that because it comes out to a very different outcome. And maybe you've got an answer right now.
Commissioner Park, through the chair, it is addressing the whole of the hoop structure development on the site. So whether it's a smaller, like a whole bunch of smaller hoop structures, or whether it's a really giant, fully connected hoop structure, the 20,000 square feet is the cumulative amount on the parcel. So the way the ordinance is set up, it's basically set up is if you're taller than 20 feet, you would not be exempt and you would have to go through a permit path. And the reason for the permit path is to still allow an option for a farmer to develop a taller hoop structure and use a taller hoop structure. But once you start getting taller, you're going to start getting into more issues and impacts and the need for building permits associated with the taller structures in order for them to be stable.
Go ahead.
Then I would oppose that 20,000-foot divide as being arbitrary and meaningless, because I think any farmer who has, I mean, what's the minimum ag parcel area? 5 acres. Anybody with 5 acres or more is that's going to bother with hoop structures is going to have over 20,000 feet. So we've basically taken away the exemption from a permit, and we're saying literally every hoop structure development is going to need a development permit route. So why go through that charade?
Yeah, and also, did I hear you say that the reason for the permit process is so they could exceed the 20-foot height limitation?
Mr. Chair, the way we set up the ordinance is we said if you're lower than 20 feet, if you're 20 feet or less of any size, it doesn't matter, you can be an acre, 2 acres, 3 acres, 20,000 square feet. If you're 20 feet or less in height, you would fall under the exemption.
But you still need a permit.
No, you would not need a permit. You're exempt.
So if I have a hoop structure and it's under 20 feet or under, I don't need to get a permit.
That's correct.
No matter how many square feet it is.
No matter how many square feet.
Now,
that divide only comes into place in the instance that you're taller than 20 feet. Rather than prohibit hoop structures taller than 20 feet, we're leaving an option open to use a hoop structure that's taller than 20 feet through a permit process.
And I want to tell you the truth. I've sat here for 3 hours, and I didn't ever hear that. All I heard about was, so I need not worry about my concern earlier. No one needs to get a permit for any hoop structure that's 20 feet or less in height. Period. And I don't know. And so,
well, wait, yeah.
If they meet the other regulations,
criteria.
Chair Blau, Chair Blau, I think a really good, succinct summary of what we've prepared is in attachment F, that flow chart. It really walks you through, okay, less than 20 feet, and then it shows you the critical paths for it. So,
I looked at that. I don't know where this point because I did mine online, to tell you the truth, but I saw the chart.
Back to staff. So if I understand you right, if we want to modify any of the MM bios 1 through 3, that would require recirculation of the EIR.
Not necessarily. To be more precise, Chair Blau, Commissioner Farini, you would have to come up with mitigation. You'd have to identify mitigation measures that are equally as effective or more so to replace that mitigation measure. You could do that. If you can do that, you can remove a mitigation measure without warranting a recirculation. Alternatively, if you're going to remove a mitigation measure and you don't have something to replace it, which is equally as effective, then that would most likely result in a recirculation, because you're now creating what was an impact that could be mitigated to a less than significant level. Now you can't get it below that significance level. It's going to be significant, and that would clearly require recirculation.
So currently Bio 3 has a requirement of, is it 100 feet setback?
Right.
Commissioner Farini, through the chair, the Bio 3 is a setback from just the streams and creeks.
And that's 100 feet.
100 feet in the rural areas, yes.
Regardless if it's being farmed or not.
That's correct. The structure, the hoop structure, would need to be set back from the creek.
So then I'd have currently 80 feet of land I don't know what to do with, because I can't farm it to its maximum ability. So what happens if I ask for 20 feet and ask staff to explore that? To change Bio 2 or Bio 1, which one are we on?
3.
Bio 3 to 20 feet. The same as farming, to make it compatible with whatever the farming setback is.
Chair Blau, Commissioner Farini, I think that's going to be problematic. So first off, this setback requirement, it's coming from our existing comprehensive plan policies. So if we start tinkering with that, we got to take a look at whether or not we could still find that these changes would be consistent with the remainder of the comprehensive plan.
And the reason with the comprehensive plan it says 100 feet is because it says structure, right? It's not talking about farming and a tool. It's talking about a structure, a barn, or a house 100 feet.
That, yes.
But this is a temporary thing that's augured into the ground that I don't see that, and I'm not going to be able to go there.
Chair Blau, Commissioner Free, I just want to say also what we would do is if you decide to changing those, or if you want us to go back and reconsider any of the biological mitigation measures, once again, we definitely will go back to CDFW and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service just to get their take on it and see if they would have a problem with a reduced setback from the creek, or if there's, once again, alternative mitigation measures which are equally as effective that we could apply.
Well, I think it's important when you go back to those agencies that they understand this is cultivated ground. That's just,
right.
It's not just we're putting up a house here.
Yeah, and also now that I see your chart and looking at it, where I have a problem is not in floodway, yes and no. If it's well, I actually think it's backwards. If not in floodway, you go no, and then you got a permit requirement. So I think that must be in floodway, yes, then you get a permit for it, right? It's a little backwards. And then I see I have some questions about 1.25 miles, 7,000 feet from a salamander pond. No, I'm going to have to get a permit. I think that's most of Jack Gresser or most of Gresser's farm, I think, would qualify. So I see that as being, I've never seen 1.24 miles before. I've seen 2,000 feet, but because I think it's 2,300 feet is the traveling distance for a salamander when he's looking for water. That's as far as he can go. If he's more than 2,300 feet, he's not going to make it.
Can I just say, Commissioner Blau, I think it would be helpful to go back to the agencies to see if we can't get some clarification on this, particularly other mitigations other than this 12 inches. If there is, and I think Commissioner Farini also said it correctly, this is land that's been cultivated. It's not new. It's just an addition of a hoop structure, and perhaps explaining this to them and seeing if they can't come back with some other additional mitigations that might apply.
So I'm still looking for a second on Commissioner Frey's motion.
I'm going to second it in a moment. I just want to ask a question of staff.
We can always discuss that afterwards. You could modify it, by the way.
I know, but I think an important thing for us to address are the biomitigations. Clearly, we talked about how the visual is more subjective and so forth, but we've got to address the bio, and I'm very interested in doing that and doing it appropriately. But do I understand, Mr. Clement, if we eliminated Bio 1 and Bio 2, then we'd have to recirculate the EIR. If we come up with something that we think is more refined, more appropriate, then we don't have to recirculate the EIR. The only problem there is that somebody might take it to Superior Court and say, well, you didn't address these environmental concerns. Of course, they can always do that with every EIR. Do I have that correctly?
Through the chair, yes, I believe you have that correctly. So, yeah, so just to clarify, biomitigation measures, if you remove them entirely, got to replace them with something equally effective. Alternatively, if we can go to the Fish and Wildlife folks and they change their mind and they say, actually, you don't need those mitigation measures, which I think is highly doubtful. That could be another option. I want to throw it out there, but I think the realistic path at this point is you're going to have to come up with something that's equally effective. If not, you are going to have to
recirculate. And then we determine whether it's equally effective.
That's correct.
Right. And of course, if somebody wants to challenge that, ultimately that can be done in court. I must say, personally, I'm not so impressed with let's talk to somebody on staff at Fish and Wildlife, and they give us a guess of 12 inches, and we never know where that comes from. I'm more interested in, do I get a professor from UCSB that says, I've studied tiger salamanders, and they need this, this, and that. That, to me, is more evidence-based, and that's what I would like to work for, something that I could really believe in. And with all that being said, I am going to second the motion.
Okay.
As I promised Chairman Blau.
Great. So I am going to ask my fellow commissioners if they have any other further comments on the motion or on the issue. Okay, what we didn't do, did we pick a date? We said July 11th. Okay. Seeing no lights come on, I'll ask for the roll call.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Commissioner Cooney?
Aye, as to the continuance.
Commissioner Brown? Aye. Commissioner Park?
Aye.
Commissioner Freeney?
Aye.
And Chair Blau?
Aye.
Motion passes 5 to
Okay,
0.
we have one other little thing we need to do here, and that is July 18th. No, I'm sorry, July, where am I?
It would be June 27th, I
June
think.
27th. That's when you were going to be gone, is that right?
Chair Blau, members of the commission, there was 2 dates I think that we were.
Oh, you're right. Here we go. I was going to do July 25th now. We have one item on there. We're going to move that to 8/1. And I understand from Mr. Wilson, there's another item coming back to us on that date as well. So we need to motion to cancel the meeting of July 25th.
Also move.
Second.
Second. All those in favor say aye.
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 All right. And then do we need to deal with the June 27th? I believe we do. So we need a motion to cancel that meeting as well.
Move to cancel the June 27 meeting.
Second.
All those in favor, aye?
Aye.
Aye. Okay, and the last bit of business is you do have binders in the back for the next meeting. Take them with you. June 6th, yeah. We are adjourned. We don't need a motion to adjourn, we just leave.